All right, so we're very excited. Good morning, welcome. My name is Luz Molina and I'm the director of the Workplace Justice Project. We're part of the Stuart H. Smith Law Clinic and Center for Social Justice here at Loyola College of Law, New Orleans. So who are we? The Workplace Justice Project was born in December of 2005 in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina as a direct response to worker abuse in the workplace for those who are very vulnerable by virtue of their low wages and often their immigration status. Wage theft was absolutely rampant. So as a result of our clients' experiences over the last 17 years, our work has grown organically to address the need to educate workers as to their legal rights and further to address the related workplace legal and policy issues that so deeply affect their lives. Along the way, however, we have found that workplace issues such as a decent wage, fair workplace policies are just only one of many of the areas that affect the lives of workers every day. And these areas impede their ability to reach, sustain, and advance economic status that gives families access to affordable and adequate healthcare, housing, education, and transportation, among others. And of course, in Louisiana and New Orleans, a very broken criminal justice system is one of the other challenges that we face in this quest for economic security. So it is time that we address these systems that far too many families are affected by, denies them access, and withhold opportunities. And even if you have a little access and a little opportunity, their administration may be unfairly apportioned. So we still end in the same place. So this work, although it's been ongoing for several years, is renewed today when we excitedly welcome you to this space, each of you, to engage in a conversation about economic equity. Because we know that this work cannot be done by ourselves. It involves the efforts of all this community, those of you present, those who are not present but are interested. It's very important. So we know that through the years, our litigation, education, and policy work has not been a lonely endeavor. It is because of all of you, our relationships, some rewarding collaborations with like-minded people in organizations that, and those of you many of you are here today, that we have been able to do this work. And this is part of a continuum where we come together today. That's our fervent hope to further this work. So why don't we begin this community conversation, which can help create a roadmap to changing the systems that do not work for families who are struggling economically. It will, I won't lie, it will require commitment to carry this conversation beyond today and ultimately to take decisive action that makes the change that we want. So I would really urge you to be engaged. This is our request to you today. And we definitely are excited that you're here. So where do we go from here? I'd like to introduce now Andrea Agee, who is our senior staff attorney here at the Workplace Justice Project, and she'll introduce you some of the worker voices and perspectives. And I think that this is a very fitting beginning to this conversation. So thank you very much for being here, and we look forward to hearing from you today. As much as you want to tell us, we are here to hear it. So Andrea, let's hear what you have to say.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Our starting point today for the roadmap is the community video, because this conversation is for and about the community. And to affect long-term and sustainable movement toward economic security, we must fully, deeply, and equitably incorporate lived experiences into our work. As voices on the ground are distinctively equipped to understand the challenges of their communities and to inform on systems that must shift in order to achieve access, opportunity, and equity. So turn up your audio a little bit and please enjoy the video.
New Orleans, what could we do? Well, one thing I keep coming back to, it's right here in our home. We have the gifts and the talents right here. Stop going out, taking someone from away to put over what you have at home. That homegrown, my son, my granddaughter, my great grandchildren, others, yours, we are grooming them to stay here. We need to look at, we do not pay enough. I've had my ministerial friends to call me and say, I would love to come to New Orleans, but I cannot come to New Orleans and take the job because you're still paying in the 50s. This is what I'm hearing my friends, white, Spanish, and even my Indian friends, my Native American friends, are saying the same thing to me every time they get an interview with New Orleans. So when I say to New Orleans, keep what we have at home, we have to figure out how to come up, bring those salaries up, the skills up. Stop living in the 50s. We must start. We must be compatible. We have to do that. We keep getting people from out of state. They'll come and they'll get all the money. You'll give them all that big money, and then they leave us. And with me, I find even in the church, we'll take someone from another place, they come and destroy what we got, they gone. Then you got to take us who have homegrown, and we have to bring us back. So New Orleans need to look at the time, stop living in the past, and start appreciating what they have grown, uh, planted. We planted the seed, we watered. Now let's watch the growth and take advantage of what we got at home. Put those nickels and dimes right here.
I believe it's important to be paid for your work because it shows value in the person. And when you feel value, you love coming to work. And it also motivates you to strive to be better at your performance on the job. I sought out a lawyer for my wage claim because I thought it was unfair to not be paid for the time that I had accumulated while working on the job, which made me feel unappreciated and undervalued as a worker. I think a lot of people will fight for their wages if they had legal representation because a lot of people don't understand their legal rights when dealing with companies and that they have worked for and thinking that they will not win their case due to little knowledge about the court.
What it would mean for me to be financially secure means having independence, the ability to care for myself without having to depend on family or friends. It's knowing that when I retire, I'm able to still be able to retain my daily basic necessities. What it looks like and what it means to me is being able to take and go on family vacations, where I can provide myself with self-care. It means is freedom, independence, security.
The greatest challenge for me as I'm 55 years old, I lost my job, during the pandemic. So the challenge for me is at this point, I thought I was going to retire, from my job, which I was making a decent salary. Now I feel like I'm a free agent, all over the place, all over the place. I didn't prepare myself to be a business owner or anything like that. So, it's really hard, if you don't have the necessary support or have the resources or have friends and, hiding places, to aid and assist you or on just knowing people in places that can, help you and support you.
They should allow local governments to regulate what the minimum wage should be, and just to make sure that it is increased for families, making life more affordable for so many families, making sure that they have that paid time off and sick leave when they need it. That should be something offered to every working individual.
Financial security in New Orleans. Having the ability and the means to be able to take care of your rent and to not just live anywhere, but to live in a comfortable, safe environment. Being able to not be extorted is where I am right now. I feel it's a new building, over 7 or 8 years old, but the company that owns it is not here in New Orleans. Now, I feel that's unjust. The company is up north in Chicago somewhere. And that's not fair to us who are here in New Orleans. You don't know our needs. The price is skyrocketing, but the ability to have my place taken care of, if something goes wrong, it's not being taken care of because someone up north, and just the other day, they had to send someone from Chicago to come fix something in New Orleans. I have a problem with this. We have too many talented, skilled persons that could do the job. But this company who does the hiring is constantly saying no. So what do we do here in New Orleans? Financially, we can't afford to stay where we want to stay because financially, we're not getting the money that we should be getting to live on and to take care of families. And then people like me, myself, who's a senior citizen, it's not fair. It's just not fair to rake us over the coal, as my mother would say. You're taking all of our funds to pay for a place to live, and then you don't give us a decent place or keep it up. No justice.
We really appreciate our community members for trusting us with their voices to further today's discussion. And now I'd like to turn it over to our Director of Policy and Advocacy, Erica Zucker.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. I want to start again by reminding everybody to please do a couple of things. One is to rename yourself with whatever name you'd like us to use today, the pronouns you use, and if you are with an organization, that organization. If not, if you're just here representing yourself, anything you'd like to identify, maybe a neighborhood that you live in, so we know, we have an idea. The other thing is Jasmine Williams Washington, who is going to be co-facilitating with me, who is our longtime consultant and friend with community science, is going to go through again the instructions for signing up with Mentimeter. The reason we are using Mentimeter is that it is a way of both communicating and collecting information. Mentimeter allows participation anonymously. I want to make sure that everyone understands that communicating is however you do it. If you type into Mentimeter, we don't care how you spell, we don't care about your grammar, we just want your ideas and your thoughts. There will also be, of course, opportunities to participate on Zoom. If you want to jump into the conversation, feel free to use the reaction button, raise your hand. Put up a thumb, anything that will help us acknowledge you. And I want to start out by acknowledging our clinic student, Shelby Gelb, who is serving as technical support. If you go into the chat feature, you can see her listed as technical support, and she will try to answer any questions or clear up any technical issues that happen with Zoom. And if you need to know how to rename yourself, if you scroll over to where your picture is, there will be 3 dots. If you click on those and go to the bottom, there should be a way to rename yourself on your own picture, and you can do that. And Shelby just put a note in the chat about how to contact her. I'd like to start this morning with a couple of community agreements for how we're going to hopefully conduct this discussion today. They said this is a conversation, and it's the beginning of a long conversation because we are talking about systemic change. Many of the people on this meeting, participating in this meeting, have been doing this work for a long time. Some people are jumping in relatively new, but what we're trying to do is figure out a way that we can make sure we're working together, because there is great desire for a more equitable New Orleans. So the agreements we'd like to come to today for this discussion are to communicate honestly, say what you mean, even if that's a hard thing for people to hear. It's important that it be heard, and in that way be accountable to what you say, mean what you say, and also be able to help back it up, understand why you're saying it. Stick to the time limits and keep it simple. We're trying to do a lot in a short period of time, and the best way we can have that conversation is to do it in a way that is easy to understand. And to that end, ask for what you need. If something's not clear, or if you don't feel you're being heard, let us know. Stay engaged, participate fully. We know it's a long day. There will be time for breaks, and we know that people will have to come in and out because it's a busy Friday in the middle of legislative session, and we all have busy lives. But when you're here, please try to stay engaged and participate as fully as possible. And set realistic expectations. We are not going to solve the problem of inequity in New Orleans today. We're probably not even going to get that far in this idea of starting a roadmap, but we want to get the idea of having a map where we are building a collaborative relationship, and know who's here and who's engaged. We want to have a picture of that at the end of the day. And again, I'll reiterate, ask for what you need. If somebody says something and it's not clear, if you don't feel like you are being heard or you're being misheard, please don't be afraid to let us know that. To do that, we've also come up with a list of terms. And before we move on, sorry, does anybody have any questions or any thoughts about the community agreements moving forward? You can raise your hand or type something in the Mentimeter. there are no questions, I will move on to definition of terms. So we have gone ahead, again, when I get to the end of this, I will ask for questions and agreements, but we went ahead and defined terms as we would like to use them today. So this is not the definitive definition of these things, but this is a way that we can have a common language as we discuss this today. So community is anyone who has an interest or who is or will be impacted by lack of access and opportunity to equity in work, housing, transportation, education, healthcare, and the criminal legal system. That's anyone. That's anyone at any level, whether you are just someone who lives in New Orleans or whether you are an elected official or the head of an organization. Anyone is part of the community. Power is the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. That's a broad definition intended to mean that power exists at all levels. And the question is, who has it and how does it get used? Accountability is ownership and acceptance of responsibility for honest and ethical conduct towards others, standing by what you do or say and doing what you promise. Systems are individuals, groups of institutions, laws, and policies across sectors that collectively shape the broader conditions and environments in which people live. We have determined that we have thought about this in this discussion today and in our work as sectors, major sectors that affect economic equity include work, housing, transportation, education, healthcare, and the criminal legal system. And we recognize that there are overarching concerns that address all of these, and there are certain things that get left that are not in these definitions, but all play a part. The biggest two are racism and a history of racism in our state, in our city, and in our country, and also immigration, as well as the environmental threat that we are all facing every day. Systems change means addressing the underlying systemic conditions that are the root causes of longstanding racial and other disparities, which are essentially symptoms of those systemic conditions. In order to get to equity, we have to have change in those systems. And finally, we have defined equity as access, opportunity, and fairness for all New Orleanians. Before we move on, if anyone has any questions or concerns about those definitions, please let us know. Can you put
Erica, I
Yes.
just want to encourage everyone to sign on. This is such an important conversation. I know not everybody feels comfortable. And if you don't, of course, we just hope that you will feel free to just go ahead and participate in the Zoom meeting and let us know. And of course, that will be captured because this meeting is being recorded. So the important thing here in this conversation is for us to really get all the elements of this journey that we're all on, because it affects every one of us, whether we're directly impacted or not. This is something we should wish for everyone in New Orleans and Louisiana, really. So thank you so much for being here, but I really do encourage you to use one of the two methods. We want to hear from you. That is really kind of rare, right? Most of us are always waiting to talk. Here we are really waiting to listen. So, and we are very eager to know what you have to say.
And I'm going to turn it over to my co-facilitator, Jasmine Williams-Washington, who will walk us through how to engage in today's conversation and move us along.
Okay, good morning again. And hello to many of you I know, some of you I don't. Hey, Chef, how are you? We are going to use today as a way of engagement, just a way, not the way, is via Mentimeter. As the WJP team has already discussed, this is an opportunity for you all to get out of silos, right? And kind of figure out how to work together towards collective action and identifying actionable steps that you all can take away from today's conversations, with the hope that collectively, you all can work together in a very strategic manner in order to impact the systems that are affecting the inequities in the economic environment for New Orleans. So a way that we're going to do that is via Mentimeter. Mentimeter allows you to engage in today's conversation anonymously. That's number one. So, hey, again, Erica mentioned, we don't care that if you're going to misspell something, it's okay. We really would like to capture the essence of what is being discussed today. And everyone has something to offer in today's conversation. And so the team would really like to hear that as well as any of your questions. So if you have comments or questions and you don't necessarily want to use the chat and you would prefer to ask that question anonymously, you're able to also ask questions anywhere on any of the slides, and we will get those questions and be able to address them as well as make any comments. It is extremely important, however, if you're choosing to bring your voices into the space as you feel comfortable, that whatever you really want captured in that takeaway, that one thing, the so what of it all, please type it into Mentimeter. It could be shorthand, it could be however you feel. And if you don't, that's fine too. Let us know, hey, we'll figure it out. This meeting is being recorded, right? But again, making sure that everyone is able to participate as you feel comfortable. However, again, today's conversation is very important because this is the beginning of an opportunity for you all to work collaboratively in this effort. And we have 2 questions or comments and it'll pop up on the screen. How can we influence consumers to understand their role in an equitable cultural economy that condemns many to poverty? So that is one question, and we want to make sure we cover that. So Erica and the team, would you all like to address that now, or would you like to address it later?
I'd like to, I want to say a couple things about Mentimeter, and then while I'm thinking about how to answer this question, because I think it's a great question and it's certainly a complex one. I would like to know, one of the reasons we're using Mentimeter and we're doing that is that we decided that when we were planning this conversation was originally supposed to take place in April of 2020, and we all know what happened to that. So as we were planning this event, we were going back and forth between whether we could have it in person and whether we could have it virtually. And it was in the middle of one surge or another, and we decided for safety's sake and to avoid having to have it, plan it and then change it, we would just go with a virtual conversation. So it's a little, we're still in this virtual world and it's a little awkward, but we're using Mentimeter to try to get as much information as possible. Our hope is that we can have the next conversation, the follow-on to this, which we'll talk about later, will be an in-person event or a series of in-person events. And that we will also, this is a precursor, this is a conversation about equity that will not only be among the people who are here and whoever we bring this, but when we go and participate in other conversations and other events. And I also want to acknowledge one other thing that I forgot in my opening comments, which are that we are aware that our dear friends, long-term colleagues, allies, partners at the Louisiana Budget Project have a webinar this afternoon between noon and 1 on the recovery agenda. And there was an unavoidable scheduling overlap there. So if you need to leave for that or for any other reason, we understand. Please feel free to come back in and out, participate as much as you can. Obviously, if you can participate for the whole day straight through, that's great. But if you can't, please be present when you're here. How do we influence consumers to understand their role in the inequitable cultural economy that condemns many to poverty? That's a great question. I'd like to keep that in the overhead as we think about markers of an equitable New Orleans as we move into our discussion to sort of hold that question for a little bit later, because I think it's going to come back.
And seeing that we have a couple of questions, people are excited about today's conversation. And can we discuss the motives? Okay, yes, we're going to go into all of those things. And I think a lot of these things will naturally come up in today's conversation. And I think the thing that Erica mentioned is that this is the beginning of a longer conversation about how to move toward equity and what systemic change needs to be made, and how and who is involved in actually making that systemic change, right? So in thinking about those things, what I am sitting with and what I'm wondering right now is what of the following systems that you all are operating in, whether it be workforce, education, housing, healthcare, criminal justice, or in your experience, if you could prioritize these systems of, from your vantage point, from your work, and your perspective, of level of importance, of the thing that we should collectively address or work toward first in order to move toward systemic change. It's not saying that all of these things are not important. It is saying simply, this is what right now, from my perspective, from my vantage point, this is what rises to the top for me. And asking that you would rank all of the question, rank all of the different systems from 1 to 6. And how we will use this moving forward is the next one. We want to have some discussion questions, and we would like to focus on the top 2 systems that everyone is kind of highlighting. However, we do recognize that everyone comes from a very different perspective. And so would also like your input and your guidance and your thoughts on those other systems as well. If you're choosing to engage in Mentimeter and not bringing your voice in the space, if you could note which system you're referencing, or if it's something that applies across all of the systems, just say, hey, it's all of them, or not put anything or abbreviate anything, and we can move forward there as well. So we have about 16 people so far who've ranked their priorities, 17 now, and everyone can see this. That's the great part. Everyone can see it, the 17. So if we can get a couple more, we can move forward and see which of these areas we should really focus on. It's not that we're not focusing on the rest of them. It's just for today's conversation, we'll focus here just for a moment, because again, this is not going to be a moment. This is going to be a commitment. We're hoping that is a commitment that many of you on the call today will say, yeah, I'm going to commit to this process, because we really want to get at sustainable systemic change so that you're actually getting to impact. And the best way to do that is collectively. Okay, Erica, we have majority actually of those on the call today who engage, and it looks like the top 2, workforce and housing, with the close education. But everyone is kind of right there together.
Right. And as we all know, it's part of the reason we're here. It's part of the reason we're having these conversations. All of these issues are incredibly interconnected. And so that's why we're taking this approach, is to start thinking about how do we do this systematically, because gaining equity or steps toward equity in one area does not bring true equity if other areas are lagging behind. So the next thing we'd like you to think about, and again, I want to emphasize that there are multiple ways of communicating. You can type something into Mentimeter, or if you feel comfortable and would like to, you can raise your hand or just unmute yourself and speak to the whole group in Zoom. Again, Mentimeter is anonymous, but that data is recorded. Zoom, you are identified, but we're happy to have
And Erica,
you here and hear what you have to say.
Erica, I just want to we have a couple of comments. I didn't know if you wanted to go ahead and just take a look to see what those were, just in case.
Sure.
All right, I think it's the same one. Same thing. We're gonna view all of them. See all of them. See all. Okay, we're good. Okay.
Okay, great. So for what we'd like you to do is for the one that we're going to concentrate on work and housing, but we want you to feel free to, as Jasmine explained, put your comments into any of these systems, even if they're not something we're discussing at the moment, or even if it's not the one that you ranked first. So if you ranked work, but you think transportation is really important because if you can't get to work effectively on time and affordably, then you're not going to be able to hold down a job. So for that, for any of those determinants, and this is to put as many of your ideas in as you can think of as possibly, and it can be short, it can be quick, it can be shorthand. What needs to change to move toward equity? And it can be the most important thing that needs to change or the littlest thing that needs to change. And who would benefit most from that change? What would a decent wage be? I saw that somebody said decent wages. We have a number on there. No quick fix, exactly. And staying in this conversation. And I'd like to unpack that a little bit later. Is what does it take to get people to stay in the conversation?
And so what I'm sitting with, I see employer accountability. What does that look like? What about employer accountability? Accountability to whom? And if there's specific things, to what are they being held accountable to? And I see that Chuck has unmuted himself.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just think that I put it in there, institutional intentionality will need to happen. I could put institutional racism, but we have institutions in our city, our anchor institutions, who I think that are the key to changing some of the outcomes around equity, especially workforce wages, business contracts, housing, all that stuff. But until we as a city can change our intentionality and see it as a real problem and really go make changes on a higher level. And I'm in this work every day, and that's what I see. It is change is needed by these major, the Oxford's of the world, the LCMCs of the world, even the universities of the world, to be inclusive and to understand that we need to make sure that we pay people fair wages that work for us, and that we're very intentional about making sure that all the community can be part of our institutions and can benefit from our institutions.
Thanks, Chuck. I saw somebody had something about education just scrolled by me. And I was wondering what it would mean to have an equitable education should be more accessible. So does anybody have a thought? I don't know who put this in there, but if anybody has a thought on how we would make education more accessible. Who needs to be part of that conversation?
Well, I want to comment about that because one of the things that really upsets me is the system of schools where you have these precious schools like Lusher, which hog a lot of the talent, and everybody pretends that that's the, that they are going to a public school when the model is like a private school. I think we need that model for every single child in New Orleans. And that's the kind of stuff that I think keeps education quagmired in low performing, underperforming schools. And until we also, as part of that, value teachers for who they really are, how instrumental they are, but we pay them little, they spend a lot of their own money, it's outrageous. And so these kinds of things have to be addressed. And whether it's government or charter schools or whatever, that accountability has to be there from both sides, from parents and from governmental municipal bodies. That's what I would say.
Also, I would say, and again, I'll type my stuff into this, but I think about, for example, we talk about wages and equity along many lines. We just had a major event here in our city, the Final Four, and there was thousands and thousands of people in our city spending a lot of money. In my mind, as I did go to the game, the championship game, I wondered to myself, how many of these dollars are really, who's really making the money from this economic boom? And as we think about our city, historically been a hospitality city, I think about institutions. I think that's an institution also. And the first question was about cultural economy. If our institutions and our customers valuing our cultural economy, we have to start first and foremost locally valuing our cultural economy and making sure that our institutions are valuing our cultural economy so that they can benefit. So I look at that. I'll think about Jazz Fest, even French Quarter Fest. What is it really? Does it really trickle down? And are people being able to make decent wages, or is the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer? And we look like we're just a city that's open and all this money's coming in, especially now that COVID is no longer the factor that it used to be, and things are opening up. Would love to see how that we can make sure some of that money trickles down, and the wages can increase for folks involved in those type of activities.
I want to piggyback on what Chuck said, because to extend what you're saying, which is of course very true, that question is very pressing for us, is let's take the example of a place like Magazine Street, which has become the darling of every tourist. And of course, then there's Ferret, which is coming up. And the zoning issues that the city chooses to allow the zoning decisions means that small businesses that are community owned or owned by individuals in this community are edged out, because as the big money comes in, they see the opportunity for profit in these corridors of commerce, then these people are edged out. And that's a problem also. I mean, you see it in the buildings. They're killing the golden goose here. It's changing the character of the architecture, it's changing the character of the business, and then the culture that we have, those of us who have lived most of our lives here, are left to watch this, in horror, really, I would say.
I think actually, so I'm going to jump on that one. I think we need to be careful when we talk about changing character of areas. Rezoning is an extremely important factor for creating more equitable development throughout the city. If we think about the resistance in the kind of quote unquote dorms to doubles initiatives, things like that are actually really prohibitive for the creation and sustainability of affordable housing and equitable development in general. And so while we do need to be mindful of the fact that, yes, New Orleans is a city with cultural character, and we do need to value that, things like that to me sound like what we need to be doing is actually creating funds for for our culture bearers, and noting that labor is done when tourists take photos of Mardi Gras Indians and don't get paid for those types of labor. That is unpaid and taken labor. So to me, it's those things I'm going to be more mindful of. Not necessarily just like what the city looks like, but how is the city taking care of its culture bearers? And culture exists in more than just the physical space, obviously. And so, again, like to me, it's one of those, we need to be mindful when we say, changing the character, because that to me is just such a red flag for NIMBYism and the idea that we should not change what something looks like because, you know, preservation for its own sake is valuable. But in fact, preservation for its own sake is extremely prohibitive and only concentrates wealth in certain areas and really only allows development in kind of for those who can afford it and not in areas that really might need it.
Thank you for that
You know,
perspective. I appreciate that.
yeah, and Nathan, also thank you for that perspective. You know, I think from my vantage point, you know, I'm the former Secretary of Tourism for the state of Louisiana, and I've seen not the individual tourists, not the consumer tourists who that may come here that exploits our culture, but I see the institutions. I see where the convention organizations, the dome organizations, the people that are using them as selling pieces to bring people to our city and to our state are the ones that also must stand up and say, these people are valuable. They help market our city, our state to the world. We have to also, before we can ask the consumer on the ground, the visitor to respect them as culture bearers, we must also first respect them as cultural bearers.
I agree. I think that something that's becoming more and more popular in the world right now is the recognition of taken land and the occupation of land. And so I think that we should be mindful of that same mentality when we think about bringing people to New Orleans, not just in terms of like what land is here, but rather what types of what kind of culture is here, and how can that be mindful, and how can we, like you said, when the dome brings people in, they are using and exploiting the labor of people that are not making any money off of it. They are like assuming that like people are going to come in, enjoy New Orleans, and love, you know, the culture, the jazz, you know, on the streets, the, you know, the soda can, tap dancing, like everything, except they're selling that, but they're not paying the people who are being marketed.
Sure.
So I think it's kind of the mindfulness of that, like funds and kind of creation and kind of kickbacks to the community is what we need to be more mindful of. How can we get the money that's kind of being used as the selling point to actually to the people who are doing the kind of unpaid labor?
And we use millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars on marketing and selling. And how do we incorporate that into making sure that the people that are, I say that, you know, we killing the bird that sings the song, and we're killing our song because we're killing the bird, and that's just my personal opinion.
No, I agree. I think it's 100% correct. There are these growing movements. I know this in California, there's a fair amount of this, where, you know, they give percentages of large events to kind of the local tribal residents that were in the areas. And so things like that can be mindful, like how can, instead of doing something exactly like that, but how can we have percentage of like large sales events go toward the culture bearers, or create a local culture bearer fund where percentage of money go to the people who are actually being, you know, like you said, marketed.
I want to acknowledge that. Thank you, Nathan and Chuck and everyone who's participated in the discussion. I've been watching the comments scroll by, and I've noticed that we've moved a little bit from talking about what needs to change to what the barriers are. And that's of course because what needs to change is sometimes defined by those challenges and barriers. And I'd like to throw something out, especially with respect to what we've been talking about with tourism. And this is something that came up when we were responding to the shutdown of the hospitality and tourism industries back in spring of 2020, is that, you know, we really need to have the people who work in those industries really need to have a seat at the table for the decisions that are being made about those industries. As Chuck mentioned, you know, we've got this tourism infrastructure that markets our city and tries to bring people in to spend money, but doesn't ever reach out to the people who work in it to say, how does it work for you? And I think that's been a big challenge. That's an ongoing challenge in all of these areas, which is that we don't tend to reach out to the people on the level of being directly impacted by these policies to say, hey, how would that policy work for you? And so as I look through the comments about, you know, higher wages and how do we get that, and unionization and organization, I think that those are very, very key things. Those are key efforts to how we get systemic changes. We're not going to get systemic change if we don't have the people on the ground level, the people who are directly impacted, the workers, or the people who are living in unsafe, unaffordable housing, for them to have their voices heard, just like we heard the community voices at the top of this program. What would it mean to you, and how would that change happen? In terms of the zoning question, Nathan, I want to say, I agree with you about density as being an important solution. And I think you have to look at what people's responses are. So for example, I live in one of the dorms to doubles neighborhoods. I think that dorms to or doubles to dorms is terrible, not because I don't want multifamily housing, but because I want multifamily housing for families that afford it, and not for landlords, some of whom are here and some of whom are absentee, who are buying buildings that used to be a 2-family double and turning it into a 12-room dorm, renting those rooms out for $1,000 a month each, and jacking up the housing values so that families can no longer move into the neighborhood. That's the kind of thing we need to look at, and what does it mean, so that not all NIMBYism is the same. And we need to be doing things for the people who live here and stay here and want to contribute to the city as residents, families, to make their homes here. I think we're coming up to break time, but I do want to just throw out open here. If there are any other barriers that need to be addressed to create access, to allow for opportunity, and to ensure fairness for everybody. If there's somebody who hasn't seen an issue come up, or hasn't seen exactly what they're thinking about come up on the screen, please put it up there. Please feel free to jump in, either by raising your hand, or by just jumping into the conversation, or putting something up on Mentimeter. And I'd love to hear from some of the housing folks on here, since we have jumped into the realm of housing.
You know, Erica, as from a housing perspective, you know, as relates to even the work that we're doing with our workforce development team, you know, their housing is so important.
Mhm.
And it's a barrier to for definitely to economic development and to jobs. We noticed that there was 2 young men who was always late for our cohort. We pay them to be part of our cohort as Earn and Learn. And we realized that they were sleeping in their cars, and they did not have homes. And the many folks in our programs, they don't have stable homes. If they do have homes, it's really a tumultuous situation at home that impacts their whole ability to be able to work, to be able to have their head in the game. And housing is so important. Not only having housing, having housing that's stable, having a stabilized housing is so important to people who are trying to get into the job world or stay into the workforce.
Yeah, and Housing NOLA just recently came out with a report, Housing for All, where they really took a deep dive. Chuck, I think you might have been on some of the advisory committees for that. They really took a deep dive in what the true cost of having affordable housing for New Orleans was. So not only what it would take to, build more housing, but also, there's a lot you could do with existing housing stock, where if we just repair it, address weatherizing issues, put solar panels on, make it so that utility bills are not so high for people. There are people, obviously there are people who can't afford stable housing at all, but there are also people who are in stable or relatively stable housing, but can't afford to pay their utilities. But if you could come in and shore up the buildings a little bit so that their air conditioning costs or their heating costs were not so high, if we could get our, the cost of electricity under control, that they might not be so underwater. So it's a many faceted problem. The other thing is just repairing units and restoring some of the housing that we already have would create more housing opportunities.
Agreed. Oh, it's also been demonstrated to be much more affordable, and it's much cheaper to restore housing stock than it is to create new housing stock. And so from like a cost benefit perspective too, it's like people think we need to necessarily create more housing, but if we look at, vacancy rates or dilapidated housing or however one you want to consider, some unlivable standards, it is much more affordable from the city's perspective to actually repair than it is to kind of create new housing.
And create more subsidized housing. Because
absolutely.
the housing subsidies under Section 8 are actually, I think people are afraid of Section 8 housing because there are lots of reasons that people are afraid of subsidized housing, some of which start with the letter R. But I think that, I was quite surprised to learn what the housing subsidy for Section 8 is. I mean, landlords get paid $1,500 a month, which should be more than enough to afford a good place to live. And that, opening up access to housing would make some of these other problems. It wouldn't make them go away, but it would also give us a way to address some of these things. Education, for example, neighborhood schools. It's hard to stick to somebody's neighborhood school when they're constantly moving. Because the housing stock is hard to maintain or is not maintained.
Wanted to know, Keon.
Yes.
Her hand raised.
I'm sorry?
Keon?
Keon.
Please forgive me.
Welcome.
You're mute, Keon. You're on mute right now. We can't hear you.
Sorry, because I'm coming in late, I'll give a quick little snippet of who I am. My name is Keon Hennessy, and I'm the program manager at Fund 17. And the reason I raised my hand is because I'm hearing a lot about repairing dilapidated properties and creating new housing, but have we talked about displacement for a lot of people who originally had affordable housing? Or have we discussed some of the ways in which landlords are able to be absentee landlords and to make the market value of these properties that really aren't up to par more expensive? So it creates an imbalance for people who were here. And the fact that natural disaster is also one of the ways or one of the reasons that New Orleans is in the shape that it still is. Like, my mother and family lives in the lower 9th Ward, and people are intentionally keeping those properties in such despair because they can just make money off of it. So I think first thing is displacement and the rate of influx of transplants that are also buying up property and making the prices less equitable for people who have been here for generations or who have been grandfathered in to some of these homes. Because I don't know if some of you remember, but I was a kid when Katrina happened, but I was still very cognizant. Some of these families who were grandfathered in, like their grandma's house, they didn't have that paperwork. They didn't have that legalese mindset. They didn't know that they were selling their family homes for pennies for people who didn't necessarily share the culture. I came in at the tourist and, paying people. But I think in order for these people to have a seat at the table, you need to not come in and say, oh, this is ideal in regards to culture or housing, because it gets replaced. The culture gets diluted.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Keon. What I like about what you said is that you're highlighting those, the power dynamics that be between those that have and those that do not have. And also the highlighting the lack of infrastructure to protect what's already in New Orleans and to protect the people, therefore protecting the culture of New Orleans. So I'm wondering, because also that kind of connected to what I'm also seeing in Mentimeter around capitalism and nepotism. And so what I'm wondering is, for those that are in charge of those systems, what is the driver to keep the systems, whether it be housing and all those other things, to keep those barriers intact? And we could say definitely capitalism, right? And the desire to have money, and we see the power grab. But for those people, those New Orleans that are within these systems that have power, what about them, right? And the desire to, you know, preserve the culture and the people and all these things that New Orleans has to offer. What about those that are involved and in charge encourages them to maintain the status quo, encourages them to not necessarily intervene, or not necessarily the city council person, not to necessarily introduce some kind of something or policy or something that will not allow absentee landlords to become slumlords, to so to speak, or to actually be held accountable to the people that they're renting to. So I'm wondering that. So that's not necessarily for you, Keon. I'm not putting all of that on you, but that's just for the people in the room, just in general. So these challenges and barriers, what is maintaining things as they are?
I think the easy answer, Jasmine, you mentioned earlier, we don't want to see capitalism or free market, but it's money, it's politics, it's money and tax base. You know, I come from a city, and I'm from up north, but please don't stone me. But from Washington D.C., and I haven't been there since '04, but I go back and forth, and I see a city that I don't recognize anymore. I see a city where African Americans don't live there anymore. I see a city where it used to be called, Chocolate City is no longer Chocolate City. And unfortunately, so many people have been displaced because of the property values going up, the tax rates going up, and so legacy families can't stay there anymore. And again, I knew the mayor real well, and Mayor Anthony Williams. He said that we're making DC better, we're enhancing DC, we're making it better because now it's going to be less crime, it's going to be less whatever. But we got to take into consideration the balancing act between making it better and getting rid of the people that have been historically there, and that's part of that culture. And that's really makes the place a special place. So we're losing, that city has, I think, lost some of its specialness, if that's a word. But I think here it's money, it's politics, and it's also people thinking that, when we do this, it's going to make this place a better place. And some of the crime will leave, some of the people will leave, and then the city will be better off financially, but also better off on many fronts. Even when after Katrina, when they were trying to, I think, redraw the map of the city, I think they had that in mind also about who should be here and who shouldn't be here. And I think that's just a big picture conversation. And I think it's capitalism, it's racism, and I think it's about the bottom line.
Thanks, Chuck. I see that Will has his hand up. William, you want to jump in with whatever you have to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of respond to Keon's point about, I think, addressing gentrification, essentially. I think a tool that could be used kind of to combat that, well, not like a perfect solution necessarily. Community land trusts have been, I think, shown to be beneficial in kind of preserving both housing stock and land for local communities who have been here for the long term, and sorry, my dog. I just think that that's a really important thing to consider, and could be helpful in this context. And it doesn't rely on the city. It doesn't need to rely on the city, but the city could certainly promote it.
Thanks. I'd love to talk more a little bit about that. I also saw that Monique Blossom put a comment in the chat that landlords have the ear of city council in a way that the people do not. That fits in with some of the other comments we've seen about, nepotism and who has the power, which we're going to talk about a little bit after lunch. We're going to talk a little bit more about who has the power. But I guess the question is thinking about how do we undo that? How do we change that dynamic. And I just saw somebody say state preemption. One of the questions that keeps coming up is what can we do, even where there's the impetus in the city of New Orleans to make some of these changes? What are we stopped from doing by the state legislature in Baton Rouge? And how do we think about undoing or loosening some of those barriers? And Nathan has his hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think kind of on that note of like potential policy solutions, there's the idea of expanding the voucher programs, which I think can be a really powerful tool, particularly when we kind of look at like the kind of the moving to opportunity research about kind of expanding, you know, vouchers and voucher holders into high opportunity neighborhoods. And I know this can be like a controversial idea about, you know, changing where people live, but there's just such good evidence about kind of moving to high opportunity areas and the long-term benefits that it has for the people, the voucher holders, as well as for the neighborhoods in general. And so I think that's a great way of kind of dispelling the idea of kind of a gentrification issue, and I think of it more of as like a smart mix or a smart housing mix, and kind of how can we create neighborhoods that are not just single, you know, income based or single like, you know, race neighborhoods or single race or single, you know, industry neighborhoods, but rather creating kind of an ecosystem in the city that allows for everyone to appreciate and benefit from the kind of the benefits of high opportunity neighborhoods. And so I just think that there's a wealth of evidence that suggests that kind of expanding the voucher program and tying it to supports to allow and to support and to help people move into neighborhoods that otherwise may be kind of out of reach or potentially prohibitive.
Thanks, Nathan. I see Lee Abbott has his hand up. Lee?
Hey, y'all, thanks. I'm Lee. I'm from Knockwalk, the City Workers Organization. I'm just speaking to Jasmine's question about why, you know, certain powers that be in the city maintain these systems that continue to either exploit or create the problems of equity that we're all analyzing here. And I think Chuck said a lot of it, and so I won't repeat all of that, but I think it's about the narratives and which narratives have city leaders and capitalist leaders in the city really tied to these issues. So like saying certain types of policies will improve neighborhoods while they continue to displace people are all tied to things that people think are positive, tied to policies that people think are positive, but actually continue the exploitation or the low wage economy or the lack of access to affordable housing. And so I think for us, it's how do we wrestle back the narrative. And I think everybody in this room, is trying to do that in different ways. And we probably need to combine that with a sharp political analysis of who is pursuing these narratives and how do those narratives gain traction, and why aren't they being challenged in certain quarters of City Hall in order to truly combat this? Like, we're all doing this, as in different corners, but how do we do this collectively in order to actually turn it around? So that's my sort of answer / question.
Thanks, Lee. I'll do that instead, because the next question we're gonna entertain is who currently has the power to make those changes, to the system. Where is that seat of power? And if you just want to throw up a quick answer to that question, and then we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we can come back and unpack that question of who has the power, how can we change that power, and then how do we start broadening that power base?
Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back.
Welcome back, everyone. Trying to read through all these comments. As we took our break, we were commenting on who currently has the power to make the changes to the system and where is the seat of that power. Judges, sheriffs, oil and gas, big philanthropy, developers, gatekeepers of community power through representative system, judges. I think that one of the things that stands out is it's people who have money are a lot of the power. So the question is, now that we've got a list of who's got the power, is how can we as representatives of community-based organizations, or there are a couple people from government agencies on here, or individually and collectively increase access, improve opportunity, and ensure fairness. And as we're talking about that, think about what sector plays which role. Somebody says voters, but we have low voter turnout. How do we increase that turnout? How do we get people to participate more in the system?
Or for those, typically, just as an organizer, if there's low voter turnout, there's a reason. Either I'm not being heard, I'm feeling like it does not matter. So what can those on the phone who are interacting and interfacing with people, from what you're hearing, how can we mobilize or encourage and foster like this civic mindset? And then how can we move toward sustainable engagement that is actionable and is accountable to community? So while we're asking people to vote inside of these things and to offer their voices that way, what needs to change about how things are currently being done so that community members, so that people feel heard and believe that change is going to happen? So what about that? What about these processes need to change to get to that point, so that not only is there a seat at the table, but they're actually being held accountable? Because a seat at the table does not equal power. I just want to say that. A seat does not equal power. How do we get to the point where community members have power? What needs to change? And how can you all specifically, or how can those that you work with support those efforts? Not just talking, not calling out, but Kimberly, sorry about that, Kimberly.
Okay, that's okay. Jasmine, I would like to comment on what you said in regards to voter turnout. I think that we have a gap in, educating people about the, not necessarily the voting process, but, who we're voting for, and, why does it matter, and what, opportunities. And let me say this too, sometimes we're looking for them to come to those representatives. I think it's time for us to start going to them. So going into those, these communities that, are, oppressed, or, that have the most needs, to, let them know that their voice can be heard, is definitely a pivot point. And I think that's what we're missing. We want them to come to us, but we need to start opening those gateways and going into the communities to serve them, to educate them, to let them know why their vote counts.
Kimberly, just a clarifying question. So educating them about the voting process, the how, the what, the who, that process, is that what you're saying? And not necessarily about the issues? I just want to clarify.
I would say, well, one, I mean, not necessarily the voting process. We know that, one, getting, hey, this representative, this is what they're representing. And then sometimes even, I think our means of media has definitely changed over the years, and people are not watching, news like they used to. Some of it is to protect your own emotional state or, well-being, because so much stuff negative is going on. So I think this is where, gatekeepers and organizations such as, yourself and this is a great organization, encouraging those representatives, hey, let's have some days where we go out into these multifamily communities, some of these affordable housing communities, and meet and greet with the people, and let's encourage them on, oh, these are the dates that we vote. I think sometimes it's just simple as knowing time frames, what we're bringing to the table in regards to, we're talking about housing, why this, is pivotal to, their lifestyle and, their well-being. So just going to them, I think, we've just waited too long for, them to come out, and that's not working. So we need to go into the communities and, educate from that perspective.
Jasmine, also, if I could just add to that, thank you, Kimberly, is that we have to go deeper in our communities. We have to build partnerships in our communities, excuse me, and we have to meet felt needs of people in our community. It's one thing to go into a community and say, yeah, you need to vote, you need to do whatever, but if we don't have a presence in that community on a regular basis, know who the leaders are, know the people in the community. I'm blessed to be serve as a pastor in a community, and I'm also serve as a community leader through the stuff that Thrive does with workforce and small business development. And in many fronts, it's a tough task, but it's a holistic partnership effort by being in the community, and we have a community center there too. So it's just really how do we figure out how to connect the dots in the community where we really become of the community. And we were then, once we are trusted in the community, then they will be able to, we'll able to get a chance to know who they are and help the community vote, help the community do other things that can help keep from gentrification in their community. How can we can help them get a voice? The neighborhood association, the churches, whoever those trusted leaders are in the community, we need to get in the communities, have agents on the ground, making sure that we're digging deep and deeper, because people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So for us to really have a voice and get them to galvanize them, they have to find trust in us, and we have to really be in it for the long haul. And we can't just check the box. We have to go deeper in the communities.
I'm wondering what that looks like. I'm sorry, Erica.
I'm sorry, I just saw that Keon had a hand up. I wanted to get back to.
I definitely was going to echo what Chuck was saying about getting to know the community and gaining their trust, because I think we need to, as a group, acknowledge the distrust of politicians saying what they represent. Like, Bill Clinton could get on the Arsenio Hall show and play, that sax really well, but as a politician, his policies did not help that same audience that he was claiming to know and be of that community. That's just like one example. I think you have to get people to understand the language in voting. Like when you go to the voting booth, it's not a clear yes and no answer. It's like, do you agree to not agree on this ordinance? And I think people also don't understand that it's not just voting about policy. It's about, housing taxes and where your money is allocated. And because some people historically have been kept out of those things to vote on, they feel like they don't have a place. So I think first it's getting to know the community, and then historically teaching them what has been happening with voting, how to interpret that language, and do the basic things like get them a ride to their polling place, tell them where it is, like ensure that they have an ID. Like, you know, if it's really an issue of those small things, because a lot of the times it is in the community, like a lot of people don't carry around identification because that $26 or whatever it is now, that's a lot of money to them. So it's just like the small things. You start with the grassroots issues and then kind of work your way up to voting and why it matters to vote.
That's a
Keon,
great point, Keon, and I want to say that you know, tacking into pulling into the grassroots is really important. And one of the challenges we have in New Orleans is we have a lot of people. This goes beyond just the issue of voting, but it touches on housing and work and all these other things, and all these other areas. So we have a lot of people in New Orleans who are excluded from those systems because they have criminal records, because they have interactions with the criminal legal system. And so one of the things we need to be thinking about is how do we engage people who are currently shut out of the system unfairly, often, usually, and how do we change the systems to have people who are shut out, intentionally excluded? How do we bring them in and then change the system so that they are more inclusive? And I'm looking at Vanessa and I see she's can't speak right now. But anyone who wants to comment on that, please jump in.
actually, I want to copy Keon on what she said. I think too, what is very important in a lot of communities too, is the language barriers. You know, to some of us that when we're talking policies and politics, sometimes, the subject matter goes over some of these people's head because, they just don't understand, in the context. If you break it down to them, that's why, as Mr. Chuck said, you need to have people that's grassroots to actually go into the community, break these subject matters down, because some of them, just looking at it from the language perspective, they don't know what it means. And, it does affect me. That's pertaining to me. They don't realize it even, pertain to them sometimes after the fact, after these policies have, been locked into place. So I think it's, definitely important, both as Keon and Mr. Chuck said, let's get ground root people in, talking, opening, the gates so you can, really have a relationship with these communities so when stuff like this come up, it's not, they just want to vote. But, yes, these people really do care. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said sometimes people want to know how much you know until they know how much you care from, as quoted by Mr. Chuck, that's true. So, yeah.
So I'm wondering a question. So I'm hearing, yes, being in community with, getting community to trust so that we can, and I'm not hearing about doing it with. So oftentimes we do things to community and not do things with community. So how can we involve community inside this process so that the people in this room and from our various vantage points are not identifying the issues, but we're doing that with the community, because ultimately they're the experts of their own experiences. So outside of voting, right, and I'm 1000% with you as far as engagement, getting politicians to go to the people, right? I'm sitting with, how do we get to that next point? And so that also gets to the next question, as far as like, what can you do specifically, more concretely, to do those things, to be in community with, to improve opportunity and fairness with everyone? I'm sorry, Darren, I see your hand.
I'm sorry, I was still on mute. My apologies. As I was saying, I think Chuck elaborated on the key point, which is engaging the community leaders from those specific areas. And once we can build a rapport with them, they in turn can, I guess, lend some credence to the outside efforts, so to speak, to address the issues within their communities. Thank you.
Thank
And I
you.
think Darren is Erica's that whole piece is so important. And also we have to look at the holistic needs of the community and the holistic needs of the families in the communities. So that's why it's so important that we touch on workforce, job opportunities. How do we help them find job opportunities? How do we help them with the kids with SAT, GRE training? It is about looking at going on the ground, figuring out who's on the ground, who's doing what on the ground, what are the gaps on the ground, and how do we feel like, and whether it's Kellogg funding it, whoever's going to fund it, WJP, how do we get on the ground and make sure that the people on the ground have the tools they need to make sure they can be successful? One of the things that we do, and I've galvanized a group of pastors in the 9th Ward, right? And we are coming together. We need a revival in the 9th Ward. Now, this revival is not only a spiritual revival. This is about revitalizing the neighborhood. This is about connecting the neighborhood together. And this is about meeting felt needs of people. The daddy, the mama, and the children. So we can do job training, and Jasmine knows about this because we're doing this already with Kellogg, and workforce training. And then we have a recreational facility for the kids where the parent is going through job training, the child is getting SAT training and doing recreational stuff. And then we have the churches that are coming together to really help whatever we need help. That we are also in a part where we are one of the defense mechanisms for the community. So when somebody wants to come in and fly in and drop in off first, you say, we're going to save the community. But usually what that means is that you're going to take from the community. So we must make sure that we have the connections and relationships, grassroots relationships, and then we're meeting their felt needs, because that's why you're going to build trust. Progress moves at the speed of trust. If there's no trust, there's no progress. So we must do something, go in the community and show ourselves to be trustworthy. No, just don't come in and ask for a vote. No, just don't try to figure out what we're going to get from them. Ask what we can give to them. And then be in there and help them get to where they need to get to. And before you know it, you're going to have indigenous leaders in the community who's going to be taking the baton and carrying it on for generation after generation. And I think that's something that we lack in our communities. We need to get back there.
Keon, I see your hand is up. Is that up again or up still?
It was up again.
Okay.
So I think one of the best ways to actually get people in motion is like the expression each one teach one. So while you have the pivotal leaders in the community, you could also be teaching this to the younger generations as well. I think like Mr. Chuck said, a holistic approach. And I think it's, aiming to heal the entire family, which will then ripple out to the neighborhood. So I think, yeah, that's it.
Professor Molina.
I just wanted to put in a plug that most of you who know me know has been a dream of mine. And although I fully support unions and what they do, of course, it's just an incredible resource. We know how politicized the whole issue has become. And I wonder whether in terms of Chuck's question, in a way, I don't know if it's responsive, we could have sort of an in-between step in whether government could facilitate the founding some kind of worker center that can galvanize workers across different sectors and be a resource, because workers are not a homogeneous group in terms of laws, issues, and so on. I mean, they're in a way where workers who toil under very low wages are a sort of group, and we tend to view their issues together. But I wonder if there would be any traction for something like that, just something that could really usher in a love of unions, the importance of unions, and otherwise give access to workers to the courts, which is one of the issues that the Workplace Justice Project has dealt with, and more we believe in that access as a way of tempering employer abuses. So I just put the question out there for comment. Thank you.
Ben.
It's an interesting point. Like, in our modern National Labor Relations Board and workers' rights, it is the form of an NLRB union is sort of limiting in terms of like who can participate and how long it takes to form and how long it takes to get a first contract. I know that I was definitely inspired by the activity from Starbucks workers on Maple, who have filed for their NLRB election, but how long are we really talking before those workers are able to get a first contract? 5 years? It will require strikes. It's not going to be fast. And the type of changes that we're talking about, if we are talking about waiting another 5 years, then that's going to further entrench this sort of systemic economic inequality that I think that everybody on this call is trying to address. And so then I think Luz's point about what role does government play in new forms of worker organization is not one that I have really contended with. But I think that there is, Step Up obviously is, organizing workers at dollar stores. And I think that there are other major corporations that are Wall Street backed that are highly profitable in our community that are really just owned by banks. That absolutely can afford to improve wages and working conditions today. I know that many of us were involved in organizing at Tulane University and Loyola University on the Sodexo campaign 10, 15 years ago. And those workers just got an increase to $15 an hour, like in the last 6 months. And so I think it's interesting to think about what is the role of government in being able to encourage new forms of work organization. And there's an interesting Essential Workers Council that was recently established in Houston that I think could be looked into in terms of what sort of more official role in government underpaid workers can play. And then Erica and many others on this call are involved in Jackson, and folks are involved in Step Up's effort to create a workers' bill of rights in the city, which would set a base set of standards that we would want workers and have the government sort of create that standard. And so definitely interested in other people's ideas, especially when we're talking about organizing in the private sector.
And to that point, Ben, I would say, just knowing some law, international law, what really strikes me is that many constitutions in Central and South America actually have workers' rights embedded into it in a very striking way that in the United States is not something that has taken hold. And sometimes I feel that government is at war with its own workers, just the way, not in the traditional sense, of course, but it's very disturbing. The court systems sometimes are not responsive despite the laws. You can't legislate people's feelings, of course, but the whole approach to workers has been to make them sort of the enemy. So I really appreciate following up on these issues that way.
Also, it seems like the government in Louisiana has been sort of over the top to attract some of these more extractive corporate interests as the sort of ways to develop the economy here. Huge tax breaks to DXC Technologies and the development that's planned in New Orleans East and Amazon and others, and in other states even project labor agreements and, ways to encourage worker organization as a, contingency of those projects. And part of it is the need for, a stronger labor movement. But I think that what is interesting that was raised is sort of what role could our local government, where there is more interest in supporting this type of stuff, have to sort of require or support new forms like non-union alt labor forms of worker organization as a contingent for that type of development is certainly an interesting question.
I think that's absolutely true, Ben. All the things that are said and the things that have been posted in the chat about workers' councils and signing on for this. And I like what you said, of course, about Workers' Bill of Rights and the work that we're doing with Step Up. And I think for everyone else who's on this conversation, that is really how we see this conversation moving forward, is that this is the opportunity to start, or in some cases continue, conversations that have been going on. But we want to take these ideas as we go out and work on housing specifically, or focusing on Workers' Bill of Rights. When we have those meetings, the conversation that we're having here seeds those conversations as well. So it really becomes a continuous process of collaboration and sharing these ideas and working together.
Erica, I just I saw a very interesting comment on the board, and I don't know if it fits in, but I was really struck by it because it proposes a European model on creating jobs. And that is, the comment is to stop relying on education as a traditional means of achieving success and encourage trade schools and other forms. And I think that that's really a very important point. It's the European model where they recognize that not everybody wants or needs to go to college in order to have a decent job that supports themselves and their families. And so that kind of thing starts in school. In the regular schools, how we sort people out, how we help them sort themselves out. I don't mean to say it's from the top, but accepting trade schools as just a wonderful opportunity for individuals, and not looking at them as step down in an educational process. I really appreciated that comment.
And if I could piggyback off that also, as we think about this community approach, for example, you look at what are the assets in your community. We need an asset mapping. For example, in the Ninth Ward, we have Sidney Collier Community College. We have our community center right next door. We do workforce training around resiliency and sustainability, green infrastructure, CDL, certain things. So you're so right. The people that we serve are returning citizens. 90% of the folks that we serve are people of color. Many of them are from the disadvantaged communities. How can they get to the next level? And it probably will not be college, but it could be getting a trade that can help them get a livable wage. And that's what we're seeing. And when I talk about this holistic approach to a neighborhood, a community, that's what I'm talking about. Looking at what the assets are in the community, looking at how that we can tap into those assets to meet the felt needs of people. And then how can we build relationships, deep relationships with that community, so that we can make sure that they are the heroes, of course. And we're creating those indigenous leaders. What role does the church? What role does the Black church? What role does the church, the faith-based community plays in this whole approach? And I think what we have done is we have gotten away from community, and we need to get back there in a real way. And once we do that, we'll be able to really meet the multiple needs of the community. They can build, they can stand up, they can take the bull by the reins or the horse by the reins, and then they can move forward. Then they can vote. Then they can keep people from exploiting them. Then they can also help with keeping gentrification from coming to their communities. They will have a voice, and the politicians will recognize. People recognize organized groups, and too many times poor people have been left behind because we have not been organized. And I believe it's time for us to holistically come together with all our assets and organize to make sure that our communities aren't exploited. Our communities can also have a seat at the table. And like the young lady said earlier, it's not about just having a seat at the table. No, Jasmine said it. Seat at the table don't mean anything if you ain't got no voice. So we have to make sure that we do that. And I'll stop talking for the day because I know I've said enough. But that's just how I feel, and I'm just so happy to be on this conversation.
It's
I'm
interesting
so
that you
glad
talk
you
about.
commented.
Oh, sorry, go for it, Erica.
I'm so glad Chuck commented, because I think that, one of the organization that Chuck leads, Thrive NOLA, is doing that kind of education that Lou's referred to. Vanessa just posted that we need to eliminate occupational licensing gatekeeping to trades jobs, especially for people with criminal records, which I agree with. I think we need to expand when we talk about what education means and how do we expand education. It needs to include all of these things. And of course, on the other end, it needs to include childcare, early childhood education, because none of these programs, as expansive, if we don't do as expansive as we can get about job creation and training, if we don't have provisions for childcare, for healthcare, for all of these other things, then those programs don't work. They don't work for the single parent who needs somebody to care for their children while they're out of the house. All of those kinds of things. So I want to think about how we expand the definition of education when we talk about access to education.
Ben had a question or a comment.
Yes, and Ben had a question or a comment.
Just thinking about sort of like how we got here and the sort of like the history of community organizing in this community that you were bringing up, Chuck. You're like, hey, poor folks are not, organized enough. And I don't know the exact number, but I believe that there were 6,000 members of Louisiana Acorn pre-Katrina, and that organization no longer exists. UTNO, I believe, had 6,500 members, and the teachers union, and are now representing folks at, I believe, 3 or 4 schools. SCIU 21 LA had, I think, 4,000 or 5,000 members. Safe Street Strong Communities. I mean, like, now we're getting up to, okay, actually there was a pretty healthy coalition of nearly 100,000 people in our city between Safe Streets, Acorn, UTNO, SCIU, Community Labor United, Hot Rock, and a lot of these other sort of projects over the last 20 years. And then don't get me wrong, the work that JAC and Together and Step Up and the Power Coalition and Vote and others who have sort of stepped into that space are doing is great. But is it, are we hitting the same scale and engagement that it took Acorn, UTNO, and SCIU a generation to build? And so I think that the investment in community organizing is like, and union organizing, especially around economic justice issues, like, and that history I think matters when we're thinking about like what's going on in this conversation.
Thank you.
Jasmine, do you have something to add, or did you want to move the conversation along?
Yeah.
The next question.
So
Now we
concrete,
get into the
the
nitty gritty of the steps.
yes, the steps.
And I want to think about this in 2 levels. One is, this ultimate goal of equity. And what would it mean to have a truly equitable city, which is that in what some would call pie in the sky. I like to have that big goal at the end, which is, everybody has access. It's that housing for all report that says it'll cost $37.5 billion to have affordable housing, but here are all the steps we need to get there. And some of them are things that will only cost $100,000, and some of them are things that will cost $100 million. So everything's a step on the way to get there. And some of these are going to be really big, like overhauling our entire governmental and criminal justice system. And some of them are very small, like organize a meeting in your community. So throw them up there either with your fingers on a keyboard or raise your hand. What steps do we need to move to create the map?
That's a hard question, Erica.
Baby steps or big steps?
We need all the help we can get in this stall.
Right, and we don't have to have the answers today. This is really a giant brainstorming session, but it's really trigger what we have.
I
Right,
just want
and
to comment, access is a tricky word sometimes. That's exactly right. And that's why this roadmap is so difficult.
Right, and one of the things we're going to be talking about is who's not here. When we were planning this event, it was, it was easy to send out the emails and the invitations to the people who work in organizations, some of whom we've partnered with for a long time. It's relatively easy for people who do this as their job to get on a Zoom for, an hour, 2 hours, or 5 hours in a day and think about this. But as I said at the beginning, to really move the map on equity in a way that is equitable, we need to have the people who are going to be most impacted, who need to be the most impacted, who need to move who need the most assistance to be really driving the program.
So one of the, Erica, if I could just interrupt for a minute, because I know I said it's a difficult question, but I should have been a little more intentional in that comment. And that is that when we thought about the idea of a roadmap to a more equitable New Orleans, what we had talked about is these determinants that we've been talking about. It's not a single thing that needs to move. It's a series of areas in our lives as workers that need to move hand in hand forward in order for equity to exist. And so when that definition of access, opportunity, and fairness is, it exists at each turn. It exists in healthcare, it exists in housing, it exists in transportation, it exists in education, criminal justice system. For example, although we all think transportation is in the lower part of the list, I have taken 2 steps to confirm this for myself and experimented with taking the bus to a couple of appointments. And I ended up having to take 3 buses and I was late. And so what do people without proper transportation, personal transportation do? They have to rely on public transportation, and there is no real plan that addresses the real needs. It's not for the tourists to get from one place to another, from one restaurant to another, from the French Quarter to uptown. Is for most of us. I mean, I'm now considered elderly and I can take the streetcar for 40 cents, but that saves me a little money. But what can we have an RTA plan that maybe has smaller buses that take people faster? Why aren't we considering the effect of transportation on the way that people can move around the city? So that's, for example, one area that we need to think about equity, access to that transportation, the opportunity to use it, and how fairly is it administered. So I just put that thought out to encourage people to talk about these things, of course.
One thing I will say, though, is that, we talk about this equity and the roadmap. I think there are 2 types of ambassadors we need. We need ambassadors that have access. We need people that, the reason why I can be successful in my neighborhood is because I have access to the people with power. So we need somebody like that who cares about the people in the community, that has power. And then we also need ambassadors on the ground who really probably know more about me than what's really happening in their family lives in the public housing. we need to make sure that if you have power and have access to power and you care about equity, then we need to figure out how you can touch the community to make sure that we can then galvanize and bring the community to the table also. You may have a seat at the table, but they can't get around the table without you. I mean, that's just real. So we got to make sure that we have ambassadors that care and people who have access already and don't use that access just for their advancement, but use that access for the people that really need equity to be at the table and share their experiences about equity or the lack thereof.
Keon has a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think in order for there to be an equitable New Orleans, we need to be culturally aware and specific of what makes up New Orleans. One of the main things that I understand is some of the people that have, great solutions and some of the best insight aren't exactly the white collar, eloquently speaking individuals. Some of them are from the 7th Ward, the 9th Ward, and they only speak in Ebonics, but they are just as intelligent as some of these individuals who have a seat at the table and the power at the table. They are just not taken as seriously because of how they present. So I think that's one of the main things that people need to get out of their head about New Orleans is you will meet some very Southern, very working class people who can also do what white collared individuals do, maybe even better.
Yes.
Lived experience is more valuable in many cases, as valuable and sometimes more valuable than education.
I totally agree, Keon. And then it's like, so then what are the barriers of those grassroots leaders to be able to be in the right rooms to be able to have that type of impact? And so one thing that Step Up has done is like some adult ed when it comes to tech and computer skills and like email and scheduling things on your Google Calendar and stuff, because honestly there's some sort of like language and work of professionalism that if we can get those tools in the hands of like grassroots leaders, it can level people up.
Yeah, one thing we say that there's been a lot of people who want to come into community and propose certain projects, development projects, and they don't even want to incorporate the community in the conversation. They come, I know what's best for you guys. And we says, hell no, you don't. and we have to turn them around to make sure they have a community discussion. We bring the community, we bring the community to the table. And the community's got to say, this is what works for us. And most of the time, it does not work for the community, but it works for the percenters who come to the table. So everybody wants it, not everybody, many people want to fly in and be the savior. But at the end of the day, we're not looking for another savior. We got one of them. We're looking for somebody who wants to be an equitable partner that's going to make sure that equity is served in those spaces. Now, every person that comes is not coming there to exploit, but many are. And the community has got to be the voice around the table to determine who's on first, who's on second, who's who.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important. And as we all come to this position slightly differently. And as someone who works for a foundation for a philanthropic organization that works with many of y'all, it is really important for us to be aware of these things as well. We talk about creating projects and about kind of participatory grant making procedures and kind of moving away from the idea of project-based grants and just like general operations. Like, we don't know what's best. Y'all do. We need the people who are doing the work to lead. And so, that's like a call from me as someone as in a funding position. And for the rest of y'all, when we talk about getting the work done, I think there is a serious need to reevaluate the kind of funding landscape and what the kind of, how do we come in and how do we present ourselves? I never want to design a program. That's not I don't want to do that. I just want to help people. I just want to help the organizations do the work. And so I think there is a I think there's an imbalance right now, as everyone is saying, is the power rests with people who have the money, and organizations that are doing the actual work often have to, combat each other or fight for grants. And that is in no way how this needs to be working. And so from my perspective, I think that there is, such value in these types of conversations. But there's also needs for us in the grant making world and for our partners to also approach the nationwide funders and say, like, we don't want you this way. We can't have you coming in here like that. And standing together as we want to do this differently. We want participatory grant making. We want, local driven, response. We want you just to give us the money. And I hear that, and I'm really here for that. And so I think there's a need for all of us together to kind of make that push.
Can I say one last thing, Erica, and these wonderful hosts from Loyola? And thank you for hosting me downstairs in your conference room as I need to leave. But I think that's something very special about what Nathan just said, and Jasmine's on the call, and any other funders that are out there. If you are funding community-based activity, you are a major stakeholder in what success looks like. So hold our feet to the fire, make sure we're collaborating together. That is going to help us build a esprit de corps in our community. Make sure that we're playing well together in the sandbox, because we have to come together on all fronts if we want equity in our city. So I just thank you for the time this morning. God bless you all, and I look forward to working with all of you to make New Orleans more equitable and inclusive for everyone who lives in our city.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you so
Before you jump off, I think Jasmine had a follow-up question for you. And I just want to say that for funders out there, yes, collaborative grants would be great. Some of us are already working together or would like to be working together. And if we had projects that specifically said, do this work in collaboration, that would be a great way to fund as well. Jasmine?
All right, Jazz, what you got? I know you're typing. I don't read that well, so just playing. What is it? Can you tell me, Jazz, on the phone? What is it? What you got?
No. I wanted to follow up about, you said including community. I wanted to say, be concrete about that. Like, what does that look like specifically? Mm-hmm. What does it look like for community to be involved in that way? I do appreciate it, however, because I do agree with you that things are done to and not with. So just thinking about that, I know you have to go, and I can follow up.
But what I'll say with you is that if I looked at a community and I looked at everybody Kellogg's funding in that community.
And we're not Kellogg, it's for the people on, I know this is recorded. Go ahead.
Yes. Oh, this is being recorded, not Kellogg. Any funder who's funding anyone.
Well, I'm just not
yeah.
Kellogg.
Yeah, I know you everybody, because you got it going on. But what I'm saying is that anybody, if you're funding people in a community, and we should look at the funders who are getting funded by whom? Small nonprofits, whatever that looks like, and look at how do we leverage those dollars together to take it further, to have a bigger impact on the community and help build equity in communities. That's really basically all I'm saying.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Take care. I got to roll, but thank you guys.
Thanks,
so great to talk to you guys.
Thanks.
And Erica, I will leave you the check for rent for the conference room space downstairs.
No worries. We'll just take it out in collaborative time.
Okay. All right.
Time. Thanks.
All right. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Yep.
God bless.
William has his hand raised.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention something, and I'm not sure if this has been, attempted or tried at all, but I think the narrative or the kind of existing paradigm with community-based organizations is this sort of like intervention into a community, and even if you involve the community, there's this underlying presumption that there's still like a 51% sort of control over what's going to happen with dollars and cents. And what would it look like to sort of flip that on its head and say, here's this funding stream, and sure, some folks from outside of the community will participate with whatever the decisions that are being made and will sort of offer guidance and suggestion, but that the kind of the decision-making process would be based primarily around only community members, and that there would be sort of like a controlling interest, instead of having the controlling interest from outside with some community input. Could we flip that on its head in a way? And I don't know if any organizations are doing that, or if there's some issues that might come up that I haven't really thought about, but just an idea I wanted to throw out there.
That's a great comment, Will. And I also think that it also makes me think about when I'm doing this work for WJP is thinking about what my role is in these coalitions. I know specifically I can think about it with respect to Step Up. WJP doesn't do any direct organizing. We have some direct client services that Luz and Andrea and our clinic students handle, working with clients. But the work I do is really around research and policy. And so when I join, for example, a coalition like the Workers' Bill of Rights, I'm very, very clear, both with myself and the folks that I'm working with, that my role is really as somebody who can help direct the policy expertise and the data, but I always defer to lived experience and to the folks on the ground doing the organizing for that people power. And I think that those, knowing where you fit into the equation is really, really important, and making sure that from my perspective, that I'm helping to empower the people whose voices need to be heard. I find a lot of times people want to let me in the room, but I'm not the person who should be talking.
Eric, I'm wondering, Luz, team, everyone, I'm wondering if after today's conversation and understanding where this process is going, if you had to say, this is our next step, what would that next step be? So to get to the end. So, but what is the next thing that needs to be done? And we see a lot of things on the board going, but if today everyone on this call decided we're going to work together collectively, what would be our collective, what will we do next as a collective to move toward, to get
First,
this?
I think we have to take stock of what's being said today. It's going to take a little while for us to process the different ideas and counter ideas that we are hearing today, and we're seeing pushed forward. And I think there's been a lot of very interesting, sometimes intriguing, sometimes controversial information here, and gather it in a way that we can then start figuring out who wants to join this effort and create a coalition of some sort. Because part of what our desire was for today was to have every kind of information come forward. We are not censoring a single thing here. And so sorting through that and figuring out who's got the interest, not the right idea, because we're pushing back from that, just who's got the interest and forming a coalition that we're happy to host here at Loyola. We have access to academic services, sociologists, people who can help us craft the beginnings of the plan as put forth by the community. I don't know if that answers your question, Jasmine.
Yeah, it does. So going through what we've heard today, sense making of that, and then after that. So once we sense make, and this question is for everyone in the room, what is the next step? So I have Matt said, hey, we need to meet in person. He's like, I'm over the Zoom stuff. I get you. I'm with you.
Yes.
I'm totally with you. And have it hybrid so those can both. But how do we move this? So we meet in person so that What is the so that we?
Well, and the mechanics of that, like how do we do that at a workable scale? I mean, I think that, you know, that Ben put something in the comments about the workers movement assemblies, which is, you know, how Step Up is working to organize around the Workers' Bill of Rights. And that's a great model. I mean, do we have one in every council district, in every neighborhood? I mean, how do we do? There's the logistical angle as much as there is the policy conversation angle.
Yeah, I think that the personal meetings are essential. It's something that cannot happen on Zoom because it just defeats the purpose of some of the comments that Chuck made, right? Caring about people, you can't do it with chopsticks, all due respect to Chinese food. You know, it has to be up and personal. You can't just have it at arm's length. So I really appreciate that idea. And I think even starting small, and if it becomes bigger, then that's one approach. You know, get a shared vision. As you know, I see Cameron's comments in the chat. You know, those kinds of things will take time because we need to be respectful to each other's ideas and approaches.
And I see Cameron also, she has a comment in chat that yes, the coalition will be great, but also taking stock of who's not here and who wants to be a part of the conversation, and moving forward with establishing a shared vision and goals that as a group you all can agree to.
Let's take one more question.
Yeah, Will is saying break was 12:30 to 1, so just let's leave it as is. I think to change that too much will interrupt the flow. Thank you, Will, keeping us on schedule.
So this is, we're moving into a section to talk about how we're accountable to the community, which we started to talk about in the last section. And how do we bring people in? How do we have meetings or conversations in a way that are accessible to the most people? So the first question that Jasmine just put up is, how should the community be intentionally engaged and involved? And just to remind people that we defined community as really everyone who is part of this process. Whether you have power or you don't have power, whether you're in an organization or not.
I just have a question here. I mean, this is where the whole thing straddles the traditional idea of organizing. And so how are we defining this? How should the community be intentionally engaged and involved? Is it direct access? Is it through organizers? I'm just curious about how people think about this issue.
I would like to just hop in before that. I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and. I think it's a combination. It's not that it's either or. I think for those on the call who are representative of community-based organizations, how can you intentionally involve community, engage community in a way that is meaningful, that community feel like they're being heard? And what does that look like from where you are? What does that intentionality look like? Okay. Keon.
I think for me, with my organization, which is Fund 17, we have a very boots on the ground approach, a very interpersonal connection with individuals. We go in and seek out the individuals who are already doing things and then give them a platform and share that. We do a lot of meet and greets. We do a lot of events in which we ask like our constituents or people in a particular neighborhood to come together by giving them that information, letting them know how they will, be positively impacted. And then from there, it's like a word of mouth thing about those who are actually in the community to help. It's like you have to keep showing up and you have to involve them every step of the way.
And when you say involved, Keon, just to unpack that a little bit more, is that also involved in the goals, establishing goals, the solutions, processes?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Like 2 examples. We have an event coming up called Bayou Bazaar, which is like an open air market. So essentially we're finding people in and throughout the 17 wards of New Orleans to be vendors, to come and perform, to pay volunteers, all to give the community a showcase, essentially. So that's one of the ways in which we do that. And then like, how else? Like through our core pipeline programs, after we get people to come through our programs and learn the information, we then allow them a position to then teach other people in the community what they were taught to help them build their businesses. So we have a very like each one teach one approach. Like I said earlier, it's, you know, gaining the trust of some people and then, you know, fulfilling that and keeping that relationship healthy, because in New Orleans, you could burn some bridges really quickly and don't even know how you do it. So making sure we ensure those healthy relationships, and then it just kind of like ripples out. And then people come to us, say, oh, you help this person, you help this organization, and we want in. Like with the pop-up crackdown, I don't know if many of you know about Cody's NOLA. When the pop-up crackdown happened in the city, we have a partner who was the front of it, like the face of the movement, pretty much, to tell the city how it was impacting entrepreneurs. So we partnered together. Now we have programs. We're helping entrepreneurs get their LLCs and EINs in a culturally specific manner. We're lending out the technology. So it's meeting them where they are by gaining the trust of their friends and friends of friends and so on.
Thank you, Keon. And I see on the board, do places of worship have a place in this outreach, and what would that look like? I think yes, and I don't know. If you have any ideas, please share and put it on the board. What would that look like? How does that show up? We also see involving community as board members and directors, so actually involving them inside the organization to, I guess, inform and be a part of that. And so that's also a way of providing power there. Yeah. Erica, you were gonna.
I was gonna say, I know Kalita is on, Kalita's on here, St. Charles Center for Faith and Action. I think Becky was on earlier. She's on their board. Kalita Lloyd with Together New Orleans is part of this conversation. That's a lot of what they're doing, is really faith-based community organizing, which uses a house meeting model to engage people and really in a similar way to how Step Up is training people to be leaders, have spokespeople, build the expertise at the ground level and have those new community experts teach other members of the community. And that both builds confidence and expertise and widens the base of the pyramid, as it were. I guess a corollary question to this is, how do we make sure that everybody, that we're talking to each other, that this community outreach is coordinated and touching each other, so that the messages are getting out consistently, so that the communities are talking to one another. How are you doing that, Keon, with making sure that the 17 parishes are all talking to each other, so that ideas go from one to one, and they're minds where they're.
Well, we kind of like took Chuck's approach, and it's the 17 wards. It's a little different than 17 parishes. So our name Fund 17 comes from the 17 wards of New Orleans.
I misspoke.
Yes. No, I just wanted to clarify because some people don't even know why we have 17 in our name at all. So we're located in the 7th ward, right around the corner from Bayou Road. So because that's where our presence is, a lot of our traction is in that particular area. But what we've been doing is a ton of networking events, meeting people who have epicenters in different cities and different wards around the city. Like we're reaching out to individuals in, New Orleans East. A lot of people don't know that's the 9th ward. So because it's so far away, we haven't really had much contact, but we have a community business incubator and meeting space. But what we're trying to do is get some of our events in different community incubators and event spaces and community centers, just so people know that our reach is a lot larger than predominantly the 7th, 4th, and 5th wards. So it's, getting our face out there and then collaborating with like-minded individuals.
I see this question is difficult.
Yeah, Matt just commented on something that we're going to be talking about a little bit later after lunch when we talk about what are the next steps. But this idea of having a community, having this group transitioning to a roundtable model so that we regularly update each other. And that's exactly what we're thinking about as we think about next steps. So for people who aren't able to come in the afternoon, that's what some of the follow-up will be, is how do we transition this conversation to that model? Who, for example, isn't here, which is the other thing that we'll be talking about, is who's not here just in terms of, the grassroots folks that we want to engage, but also who wasn't here because they weren't able to be here for some reason. For example, there wasn't anybody from RIDE who was able to attend today, but they're the leaders in a lot of the work around transportation equity in New Orleans, just something that has come up. So there are lots of folks who we want to make sure are included as we think about continuing this conversation. One of the things that we want to be, one of the reasons we're having this conversation today is that we don't want to be in a situation where we're reinventing the wheel. There are lots of folks out here in New Orleans, many of whom are represented on this call, but many of whom are not, who are already doing this work. And we want to make sure that all that work is incorporated. And I see Darren, who works in the District E office, has his hand raised.
Yeah, I'm gonna be getting off the call shortly, but I just want to let you know who I am. My name is Darren Martin. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for Councilman Oliver Thomas. I will be leaving my email address in there, so you guys are welcome to forward any issues I've been taking some notes regarding, and just looking forward to working with you guys going forward.
Thanks so much, Darren. We're glad you could be here, and we will be sharing all these notes out eventually once we get them collated and together. We'll be sharing them with everyone who's on this call, and you will be free to share those with other people as well. Thank you for being here. Jasmine just put a new question up. Conversation. Historically, community is not compensated for their lived experience. And what does compensation look like for community members? And want to think about that. That's something to think about all the time. So for example, I'll just give an example. When we engaged community members for the Community Voices video, a couple of the folks who were on there, I know because I talked to them, were Step Up members who gave their time, and they were compensated for that time. And that case, it was monetary compensation, and the conversation went something like this. I'm going to compensate you for the time. Oh, no, you don't need to do that. I was like, yes, I do. Your time is valuable. All your time is valuable. Paid for time, paid for costs, paid for transport. All those things are really important. What are other ways? I mean, obviously monetary compensation is really clear, but what are other ways to make sure that people are really compensated for their work and their time and their expertise? And Keon's comment about 1/3 of New Orleanians do not have technology or access to Wi-Fi makes me think that maybe we should start giving out hotspots. Which I recognize is not a long-term solution at all. Yes, communities have access to nearby good jobs. I also say that, and this goes back to the comment earlier about accountability for use of public funds. That one of the ways that communities need to be compensated is where we're giving up taxes, where we're giving up land, where we're giving anything away that is ours. And anything that is public, whether it's taxes or funding or buildings or land, belongs to all of the people, that there needs to be some kind of compensation for that. And it should be, if it's a program, if it's a development that's creating good jobs, if it's a development that's creating jobs, those jobs should be good, living wage benefits, other community benefits, grocery stores where where we need access to food, childcare centers, healthcare, accessible healthcare, all of those things that we've been talking about need to be part of any public spending program.
I think the idea of grants is a good idea for this kind of thing because, I mean, unfortunately, some of the work that we do sometimes is just volunteer work, right? It's additional to the things that we do. Or the organizations have very, very few resources. And so how do you fund these things? I think this is where funders can have a big impact to allow for this to happen. And what kind of situations are we thinking here? I've seen some comments. Oh, we've switched to the new to the next question. All right.
That's what popped a new question in there. What decision-making power should the community have in this process? I think we have to define the process, but I agree with whoever just said all of it. Community should be participating, and that participation should be as broad and inclusive as possible. And
but what is the process? Is it in this process, or is it in the process where we access power? I mean, I think we need that discussion first.
I think it's the process of the roadmap. So what control and what decision-making power do they have and input into what is actually said that this is what's going to be done? Because the roadmap is in essence the strategy. And so what decision-making power do they have to veto something? Like, actually, no, I don't want that here. So what process is that? What shared power goes on that? Is it shared power? Is it 100% community control? What does that look like?
So I can put here that the process means creating the roadmap.
Mm-hmm.
So as we move forward with this idea of we're going to come up with the steps, that means who gets a say. And I agree that everybody needs to have it. I think that that's where different levels of recognizing different levels of expertise comes in, because there will be questions that come up with what can we actually do. Throwing out an idea and whether it is executable, but also lived experience is essential, because if somebody's going to say we should do something, we should have more bus routes. How often they should run is going to be based on what people's actual needs are.
So I wanted just to clarify, Erica, just to clarify question, is expertise different from lived experience?
No, lived
Okay.
experience is a way, I don't think so. I think lived experience is a level of expertise. I mean,
Okay.
I have expertise
That's not for
in some
myself.
things because I went to law school. Somebody else has expertise because they've done a job for 10 years or, you know, had life experience. William has his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer maybe like an analogy to like lawyering essentially. Like you can lay out the process for folks, but in the end you want to give them, like your client, essentially the agency, to make their own sort of strategic decisions. So I think that's kind of maybe an okay model for those of us that are in that sort of realm. And I'm sure that that analogy tracks with other sort of advisory roles, but I think that's kind of the relationship with community, you know, that should be established, is like, here's the tools, here's what knowledge exists, but the ultimate decision, you know, that yes or no is finally left up to community, sort of 100%.
That's a good analogy, Will. I must say, I thought you're right, or maybe you knew that already. What is it about this question that stumps us so much about this decision? I mean, this is such an important question. I'm very curious about the different ideas about it.
I mean, I think it's a hard question because it's like, what process? Like, are we talking about the process to give money to community people to share their stories, or just have the process in, or we're talking about generally the process of building power to change our economy? You know what I mean? So I think it's a hard question because the like the process about what decision-making power a community should have is, it's hard, is not defined well. But I think that my short answer is that, like, it should be, you know, as much as possible, you know, with structure and support.
Well, I think there are two conflated things here, or maybe I need some redirection here. So there is the idea of how do we collect information for designing a roadmap that is inclusive. And in that process, we're talking about compensating individuals for their lived experience. And then there is, once you have that information, then it in some ways is returned to the community for to give them back the decision-making power. It's what Will talked about. We put it together in a way that has some advocacy, some power, some impetus, and we say, is this what you said? And then how do we move forward with what you said? I don't know if that resonates with how this discussion is going.
I think it's
Oh, go ahead, Jasmine.
No, I was going to say, I think it's unclear because the process as it stands is unclear, and what it would look like is unclear. So if the process that we're speaking of is the roadmap, and we're saying how will we engage community inside of this process? If there was to be a coalition or some kind of collective effort among everyone, what does that look like? And I think it's open and it's broad because we're trying to figure that out right now, and that's okay. I don't think that we're driving toward the answer today. I think Erica mentioned earlier, like, this is just the brain dump in the perfect world. So if it is decision-making power for the resident, not the resident, but for the roadmap, if it's decision-making power within their own spheres of influence, if it's their decision-making power into identifying issues and how to move forward, what is the it? And so from wherever you sit, so not getting stuck in trying to get, like, we know exactly where we're going right because we don't.
No, I appreciate that. I was just reading some of the comments here. I appreciate the comment. Can decision-making power be reinvented in spheres of expertise, which is how we started, really. We've started talking about these determinants. And so the lived experiences of people where those determinants have been particularly brutal in their lives are going to be the ones that are going to have very insightful comments about how we approach it. And so, yeah, I think some of it, that comment to me is very responsive to how we started this process.
Well, and I think if we look at the, the roundtable model that Matt mentioned in the comments earlier, that, we transition into some kind of roundtable, presumably there will be multiple roundtables, right? Because it's always incorporating more and more people. And I could see, Fund 17 helping to organize roundtables in, certainly starting in the 7th ward and, moving out to the wards that you have the greatest contacts, and having those folks help develop roundtables in other areas. Together New Orleans can help organize the same thing. Step Up is certainly doing that. And then, just looking at that model, just always making sure that we are touching base with the people who really need to be guiding the roadmap. So, those of us who work in policy have kind of a bird's eye view, but we really need to always be touching base with how would these policy, what are these likely impacts on the ground? Jasmine just reminded me that we have a couple of questions remaining. I am cognizant of the fact that I know people want to jump off for the other call. Matt just raised his hand, so I'd like to hear that, and then maybe take a quick breather, take our lunch break, and then come back, answer those last 2 questions, and talk about next steps. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up that this is difficult work, and that's okay. Often we don't know how to break down these processes because we don't have a lot of experience in them, right? We're in a system where we're often taken away from being allowed to make decisions about our own lives. And so the idea then is to think of different models of how do we make collective decisions, whether that's consensus modeling or very different modifications on that, or like you're saying, roundtables or spokes councils. There's a lot of different things we could explore in terms of producing collaborative documents or collaborative positions. Wanted to bring that up, that it's okay, and we can keep working on it as we move forward.
Thanks so much. I think we're going to take our lunch break now. We're going to reconvene at 1 o'clock when we will be continuing the conversation about accountability and thinking about how we take this into the next step. So continuing this discussion, I hope you all can come back. I hope those of you who do attend the budget project conversation have lots more to add to this discussion from that. And let other people know that we're still going to go. We'll probably have about an hour after lunch, maybe an hour. We'll probably go for about an hour after lunch. Thanks so much. We'll see you all soon. Come back, everybody. Hope you had a nice little break. Got something to eat. Walk around the block. Enjoy the beautiful sunshine. For those of us who are here in New Orleans. We're continuing the conversation about accountability to the community. Accountability within the community, making sure that this work that we're doing to create this roadmap includes as many people as possible, so that we are truly looking to an equitable New Orleans, and that the people who have the farthest to go from where they are now to true equity have that opportunity to participate fully in the process. So I think we want to spend a little bit more time on this issue of this question of how we are held accountable to the community in the process. And the first part of that process is in creating this roadmap, because while we've had a lot of conversations or a lot of talk about what changes need to be made, to really measure what changes need to be made and what order those changes should be made, and how we make sure that the things we're working on are connected to other areas in each of these 6 determinant areas, which I'll reiterate: work, housing, education, criminal legal system, healthcare access, and transportation. And in each of those areas, efforts toward equity are moving together, so that steps are being made, so that step forward in one area isn't necessarily negated by having stepped backward or no steps in other areas, as we try to do this long, slow process toward equity. So if the first piece of that is creating the roadmap, how do we make sure that we have participation and accountability in creating that roadmap? I'm talking again on mute. I see a response that I think comes from our friends at the Wage and Hour Division about providing the compliance assistance we're tasked with providing to employers and employees alike. And I think that's important in terms of how do we build an accountability, how do we create equity, which is really having these, when we talk about access to systems and access to change, is making sure that that access really is accessible. So that if we say there's a process here, that process really includes everybody, and that it's not like you're just going to go through it and nobody is going to be listening on the other end. So thanks for that. How do we create checks on ourselves to make sure that we're being held accountable and that we're being as inclusive as possible?
Newsletters, we can have calls. I mean, we had, I know you worked tirelessly to get people to commit to today. And, you know, people have lives and things that interrupt their lives. And so how is it that we can create this line of communication in the way that's most accessible? So for me, as I teach my students, less is more. So what would that look like, and how do we learn to synthesize our messages? I would think that that's a really important thing to consider, because we want a lot of information in this convening. We want to hear it all, but how does this then transform itself into what our community wants to hear, right? So there are instances for listening, and then there are instances for gathering information for everyone, for every individual. I'm that way. When I need information, I seek it out, I process it, and then some of my actions are shaped by that information. So if we just address it in the way that every human being does, and I'm not an expert on communication, but maybe this is the kind of individual we need in our midst.
I'm wondering if this question is kind of hard, like the other question was, because we're unclear about where we're going. But it appears that there are a lot of ideas. And what I really love about what's being shared is the varying of the ways that we could share out information, so that there are different ways that people can receive the information. To your point, Luz, about the information overload. Some people may be like me and all they want to do is watch YouTube, and I have no desire at all to watch anything else. Maybe like that. So what does that mean? And to your point about the podcast, maybe people prefer listening instead of reading, but making sure that it's accessible. There was a comment about that as well, making sure that it's accessible for everyone.
Yeah.
Well, and I
And
think
I
that
guess
maybe-
we're, I'm sorry, Erica, just something that Jasmine said triggers my thinking here. So when we say, how are we held accountable to the community in this process? I see we all kind of piggybacked of each other in terms of saying, oh, sharing information is how we become accountable. It's almost by default, but maybe that's not where the discussion is. It's not about just communicating a particular message, right? Because the accountability is also the doing. And that's, you know, where we win, where we want to end up is what do we do with all this information? So that discussion here on this question has to pivot to a different kind of accountability. Just communication is just a very small part of it, I suspect.
Yeah, I think that's also, I think I saw a message about, to Erica's point earlier about the demographics of the group and something about who's not here. I don't want to make assumptions, but because it is anonymous, I am wondering if we're sharing demographic information to have additional, bring in that diverse voice, the diversity of voices inside the work group. So that's where I'm assuming, and I would not like to assume, but I think that's where that comment was going.
That's where I assume that that comment was going as well. I mean, we know who's here by groups. We also, you know, we also know that there were a lot of people, and I know, given that everything that's going on right now in the state and with various people's work, that a lot of people who registered, and in part because I told them this, I said, if you can't be there, registering will make sure that you get the recording and the documents and are included in this process going forward. So, you know, it's a small representation of people who initially engaged with this process, and we hope will engage going forward. I think that maybe this is a way we can incorporate this question about accountability as we think about the next question, Jasmine, and maybe go back and forth. I think you can toggle backwards in Mentimeter if you want to add something to a previous question. But as we think about how we're held accountable to the community as we create the roadmap, in order to do that, we also need to think about who else needs to be part of the process of creating this roadmap. People, and you can get as specific as you want, particular organizations, particular people, if you know somebody who's a community leader, and if you don't want to put that person's name specifically in Mentimeter, but you think that we should reach out to them, you can either contact them yourself, especially when you get the follow-up. You can invite people to participate in the process. You can also either email me or put something in the chat that we'll keep confidential, but contact information for an individual or an organization or a leader at an organization who should be included in the process. So, you know, who isn't here? Anyone can be included in this list. So if there are organizations that you work with or that you know about and you wonder why they're not here, throw them out there.
This question of SLLS, I mean, that's a tricky one for them because they're federally funded and they have a lot of restrictions. And so maybe not the organization, but the individuals there.
Somebody commented people who are well-versed in class action lawsuits. And that, of course, is a conversation down the road, is, you know, what is the best way to get more access for people? Is it through the legal system, or is it through changing policies in other ways. Getting a little ahead of myself.
I wonder if it would be helpful as we go through this process, this journey, to, and we have a bunch of them, create that mapping that somebody had suggested earlier of who's involved where, because I think it's important also, and I say this with caution, not to be indiscriminate in who you reach out to, because I think groups that are too large then become unwieldy in some ways. And so as much as you can concentrate who's working where, that becomes a little more effective. You know, I think that's one of the tricky parts for me, is being all inclusive, but then too inclusive then becomes unmanageable. And I mean, let's not really gloss over human nature. I mean, people want to own things. They want to own conversations. They want to own groups. They want to be the ones. It's the us and them kind of thinking. So, I mean, this is all for discussion.
Somebody put community representation from underserved areas. Can you be more specific? Are you thinking about geographic areas? And are there enough trade unions or union folks on the call? The answer to that is no. They'll hear from me later.
Of course, in a non-adversarial way.
Of course. So sorry you
Just
missed
a little southern nudge. I would like to hear any comments if y'all are so disposed to this idea of being too inclusive, where it just becomes diluted, and being inclusive enough. I'm just very curious because I'm struggling with that. Nobody has an answer?
I think if you do it right, there's no such thing as too inclusive.
Jackson Voss has something to say.
Oh,
Yeah, I can.
Hi, Jackson.
Hey,
welcome.
Sorry I've been quiet so far today. I have been listening in. I've also been, we just got off of our webinar a little while ago, but y'all have been having a great discussion, and I'm glad to be able to participate now. But I've had the experience of trying to do a big group recently to coordinate something with our recovery agenda work. And I really found that the truth is it's so much easier to include as many people at the front as you can, especially because inevitably people drop off. And you end up being left with a core of the people who are going to be working the hardest on this and are the most bought in. So I would definitely encourage people to be as inclusive up front as you can.
Sort of like what happens with these presentations.
Yeah, and I think that's okay. You know, I think there's
but that's I think that's the pattern.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that like there are some groups that I was hoping would work with us on this agenda this time who didn't, and I'm hopeful that next time, if I include them again, maybe we will. You know, I think it's just a matter of continuing to build on that.
Well, someone agrees with me.
Thanks, Jackson. I was just looking at a comment too that says, oh, it just disappeared. This is the thing about these scrolling. Something about it depends for, I want it to scroll up so I can see it again. One more scroll on the right-hand column. Jasmine, how do I make that happen? Maybe it's one more after that. A group that's too big that can stagnate the process. I also think that I think that you want to have people come in as much as possible and be represented. I mean, I think what Jackson said is true, that, you know, you want to reach out to as many people as possible, and you want to make sure that the lines of communication are open. Not everybody is going to want to come to a meeting. Not everybody is going to be able to participate in a process all the time. But I think that it needs to be very, very, very clear that it is open to anyone. And that there's going to be a core group that is going to make sure that we don't lose it. And that we don't get subsumed. And this is something we haven't really talked about because it's really for later in the process, but it's very important, going back to the power discussion of earlier about who has the power to make changes. And what was said about the cultural community is that one of the challenges is making sure that this discussion doesn't get co-opted by people who already have power, because I think that is a detriment to progress, is often that it gets latched on to by people who already have power, and then they limit the effectiveness. Catching up with Matt's comments here in the chat. Next step may be to develop a statement of purpose that can evolve. That sounds like a good next step. And on that power, to make sure that power continues to be, the base of power continues to be broadened and be as inclusive as possible, so that we actually make progress. Really that's how the relationships have to go, because when you have relationships and trust, then people are more inclined to work together to really push for demands.
I think, Erica, we did invite city leaders, didn't we?
We did, and we invited the civil, we did invite all the members of the city council. And Oliver Thomas, Councilmember Oliver Thomas, did have a representative here.
Right there, we have a problem.
Exactly. I mean, I do think that, you know, one of the things that we've talked about with that Step Up has been talking about is they're working toward the campaign for a workers' bill of rights, is having they're using the model of the People's Movement Assembly, and one of the plans that's being formulated is to have People's Movement Assembly meetings in at least one in every council district. And, you know, we could do that kind of meeting to talk about, you know, take the roadmap roadshow out, and in every council district have a meeting inviting people in that geographic area to come and talk about what would it mean to create a roadmap. So we take the people who have been participating in this conversation and say, okay, who do you know in district A, B, C, etc. D, E, not meaning to forget the folks out in Gentilly East. Commented, as with most things, it would be good if groups or people did what they should be doing in the first place. So maybe it's not what additional groups, but how to light a fire under existing groups and people. And that's great. That I said something earlier about not reinventing the wheel, that bringing in people who already have the connections, the expertise, have done some of the groundwork. And how do we do that in a way that doesn't undermine or come off as threatening to existing efforts?
Well, I appreciate that comment, because one of the issues we have here that we hadn't talked about is how we are accountable to each other. And we certainly have been in efforts where that accountability has been absent. And I think that that's something that has to be critically explored, because the idea of coming together also means the idea of understanding compromise. And in those spaces where compromise has to be explored or agreed upon, then people can get disaffected if they don't if they don't buy into those rules. That's how we started this whole conversation. There are some rules to this conversation: respect for each other. We want to hear all about it. Well, any kind of movement forward on this conversation is going to require that the community that comes together accept those rules and abide by them in order for it to work. That accountability as between each other is as important as our accountability to the communities that we want to join in solidarity and move forward with them.
So thinking about that, Luz, and building off of that, what are ways that we can be accountable? What concrete other ways, in addition to what Luz has offered?
Yeah, that respect is so important. I had typed something really fast. I'm a fan of Paloma Faith, a British singer, and she has a song that says, "Do you want the truth or something beautiful?" And so truth can be difficult to hear, in our personal lives and in our outside lives as well. So.
And I think it's speaking truth is really challenging if there's not trust.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Have to agree. Won't be hurt by others telling us the truth about our own shortcomings. And if you really believe in this effort of equity, if you really believe in equity, then you have to be accountable. You yourself have to be accountable to shortcomings, blind spots, things you may not recognize in yourself.
Well, I think there are individual and community biases. And so we resist what we don't understand, what we fear. When we feel threatened, we're much more hypersensitive. And so I agree with Erica, this idea of trust, but then it begs the other question here is, how do we build trust with each other? And I put down integrity. We do what we say. And that's a beginning. I am going to do X by Friday, then I do X by Friday, because then the community knows that you can count on that person to engage in that activity, as they said. It starts with small ways, but when we let go of those small tasks and we don't communicate that we can't do them or we'll do them later or whatever, we start eroding the trust that we place in each other initially. Because I give everybody the benefit of the doubt originally. They can chip away at that. After a while, then I have to make a reassessment of what my relationship is to this organization.
So I added to the chat assuming good intentions, which are sometimes a community agreement in conversations like this, and calling people in instead of calling out. So until somebody does something to not earn your trust, assuming that they're trustworthy, which is sometimes hard, particularly if you have a history with some groups or organizations. It's getting past personal feelings for the greater good, but using all of this accountability is also about educating each other and helping each other make those journeys.
Yeah.
Oop, the screen just is, oh, there it goes.
This also begs the question of how do we prioritize this idea of economic equity? It's a big topic, it's a big thing, but it's also small in the sense of it affects every single individual. And so it exists at two levels. And so how do we make space for that? How do we just don't look at it as, oh, well, it's too big or it's too small? And how do we become generous enough to spend the time to look at it in a kind of a academic and emotional level? Because there are so many moving parts, and so we can also get discouraged, even if we are investing all of that emotional space, all our intellectual efforts. So when I talked at the beginning about making that commitment to move beyond today and these conversations, that's really what we're talking about. That idea that you have to speak with yourself and say, okay, do I have the time? Do I have the emotional fortitude to move forward with this? Because sometimes it'll be good, sometimes not so good. We have to be able to take in what happens, and that, dare I say it, that we can disappoint each other in ways that we don't intend to happen, but that it does. You might be disappointed by somebody's position because it damages another one. The reconciling of all these ideas. Not everybody's ideas can be implemented, even though they may be wonderful.
Yeah, I want to just go back a little bit to, for us at Workplace Justice, where some of the genesis of this conversation, this idea of determinants of economic equity, comes in large part from our participation in a advocacy community of practice that was organized by the Greater New Orleans Foundation. And it was advocates from around the city working in different areas on social and economic justice issues. And all of those folks were invited. Some have participated. I don't know if there's anybody on here who was part of that cohort. But we met for 3 or 4 years and did learning community type things, which is skills building, but also building trust. And one of the things that came out of that policy community was this idea of really supporting each other in our efforts. And so, doing things like sending out a letter to all the other members saying, this is what's happening. How can you support us? Either with time, with people, with letters, with showing up at city council, whatever the thing is. So I think that the genesis of this is in that. And I think some of that work continues with this, but we just want to go a little bit deeper because in that group, as policy advocates, some folks were providing direct services or direct organizing, and some folks were just really taking the policy angle, and so didn't have a grassroots constituents, a direct grassroots constituency, although I think we all have in some ways a grassroots constituency. So I think it's, you know, that level of, some of that level of accountability is just being responsive to somebody saying, hey, this bad development is happening in my neighborhood and I need support from other folks because this is who it's going to hurt and that's going to undermine equity. How do we show support? And some of it is sitting down and doing this nitty-gritty work of what are the next steps we need to make so that these harms don't happen to people who are continuing to be harmed. So it's on every level, building that network and support.
That's right. I think I saw a comment here about taking on difficult conversations. And I think, of course, economic equity definitely envelops a lot of difficult conversations. And I think Jasmine had talked about this at some point in her comments about how we can speak in ways that seem loud and disturbing because they haven't been heard. And so how do we give space for people who traditionally have not been heard and who have their own disappointment to contend with? And so how do we help each other to hear and to process that kind of information in a way that leads to that respectful speaking to each other? I mean, I think it's foundational in some ways to the process that we are seeking to begin to shape. In some ways, I'm too academic, and so I run to the idea, well, we should have somebody who can talk about trust and how do we become accountable to each other. But I think maybe that has to be a personal conversation when we all get together. What do we think? You know, maybe it's too touchy-feely, but it is foundational, because if we don't know that about each other, how do we trust each other to move forward?
Anyone have any other thoughts? Or we move on to thinking about, now that we've put all these good ideas out there, how do we move to the next steps?
Okay.
And to aid in that transition, we have a new question. Describe today in one word as we transition into this conversation about what the next steps are.
Eric, I just want a moment of transparent facilitation. I just want to say that we went through next steps or potential next steps, and the next one after this is the closing out of next steps. We captured that before we went to lunch.
Okay, thanks. if you put words in the chat, I'll copy them and put them into Mentimeter in case someone's not logged into Mentimeter.
See some words, Erica, on the chat.
I know I got locked out of Mentimeter. I was just about to comment.
Our first little glitch has been
Our first
perfect
little
so
glitch.
far.
We've been glitch free as far as I know. I just as I would put words in the chat, I realized I couldn't get into the word map.
You're back.
It's not letting me go back.
Maybe Jasmine.
Try to refresh it now, Erica.
Okay, there it goes. Okay, now I can enter words.
What's in yellow, Jasmine? It just chooses different colors?
It's just the color scheme. It's just the color scheme from your logo, and it's just choosing.
Amorphous is very interesting to me.
And the larger the question is, the statement is, that means someone put it in more than once. Someone.
Oh, okay. Ooh, dense. Lord have mercy. This is a dense topic. Esoteric, Lord. I feel sorry for myself spending 43 years of my life. I love that word.
And how can we improve the next discussion? A lot of food for thought. A lot of thoughts about how we move forward. How do we improve the conversation next time?
Everybody has the same idea.
With food, acknowledged. In person with food outdoors. That is actually what we've been thinking about for our next conversation. When we originally started talking about this, that was part of the next thing, was how do we do it in a time that's more accessible to more people?
When would that be?
Maybe on a weekend.
Saturday? Would people be willing? Would a Saturday work?
We can send out a poll
Mhm. Hold on.
times for the next. I think it depends on the kind of conversation.
So if this was too long, how long would have been good enough? What would have worked? A salsa session, all right. We'll have to have some salsa music on the next time. Thought-provoking game. Oh, this is wonderful. Lots of great ideas. Oh, no weekend meetings. Okay, thank you. I'm with that.
Well, and it may be that we have to have different kinds of events and different places and different times for, depending on who we want to bring in.
Oh, there's some great things on the chat too.
Yep.
Broken
putting
down over 2 or 3 days for an hour or so each day, 2 hours. Wonderful, yeah.
Yeah, there are a couple of events I went to over the last 2 years that normally would be a 2 or 3 day conference. That were done that way over several days.
Yeah.
And I agree with the person who says no weekend meetings, please, because of work-life balance. I think that goes to the, who do we want to have at the table and how can we bring them in? And for some people for whom this isn't their primary work, the only way that they can participate in the conversation is if it is done in a way that allows them to participate, which goes back to the conversation about compensation. And those are all things we need to think about going forward, is how do we make things accessible and inclusive for everyone.
I wanted to follow up with a comment that somebody said, include more community members. That is the second part to this series. And so we did it in 2 sections, of course, because of the exigencies that we were faced with COVID, for sure, and having to postpone it 3 times or 2 at least. And so the second one is, at least one of the things we're thinking about is that it will include as many community members as we can. This information here, perhaps collect data before conversation so we can determine goals. Absolutely, this is part of what we need to do here. This was big for us too, dense for us too. You know, I'm not undervaluing that comment. It is a dense topic. It is a difficult topic. So those of you who have stuck around, we just really appreciate it.
Still muted. Jasmine just put a poll up. And Matt Olson raised his hand. Matt, what would you like to say?
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to share my experience with the Greater New Orleans Organizers Roundtable, which I thought was a very successful model of something similar. It started in 2007 and I think was still active through about 2016 or so. And basically it was a model of people being able to have a space to come together, share information about what was happening on the ground, share what their work was, and it ended up creating a lot of trust between different turfs, different communities, different neighborhoods, different issues, and usually it would be about 3 hours on a Saturday afternoon. Seemed to work well for community members to come as well, from member-based organizations. It was only scheduled, I think, every other Saturday or maybe once a month even. And it just built up a lot of relationships and for us to understand our issues, each other's areas of, I would say expertise, but right, what we might be focusing on, and understand those better, and how our own work kind of overlapped and could kind of raise up each other's work. So I just think, it wasn't a binding body where we had decisions that we would make collectively, but it was a space for solidarity where you could be like, okay, you're going to have this thing where you go before city council, and maybe we can show up for that, right? We can build that in. So a lot of cross-organizational organizing as well as information sharing. Just wanted to put that out there as a nice model, and maybe we could have the co-conveners who are still in the city and still doing great work. Monique Pardon is at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, and Dr. Kimberly Richards of the People's Institute, if they want to share their experiences as the facilitators.
That would be great, Matt. Who, just for clarification, who was what were the sort of criteria for being part of that network?
The criteria, I'm trying to think back. And of course, this is the post-flood landscape of organizations. And what when I remember it was Luz or someone else bringing up, oh well, having governmental officials can be tricky. It certainly can be, and that came up during the roundtable, and we often have rejected having politicians there unless they pre-scheduled. So if they want to do a presentation or talk to us about something, that's okay. We could the conveners could kind of negotiate that. But the parameters for members themselves is usually your community organizing in some form or fashion. It may not have other members, but you're working on kind of community level issues. So we had a lot of public housing organizations, we had environmental organizations, we had right to return organizations, police oversight, a very kind of wide spectrum of community organizing represented. And that was the inclusion, the inclusiveness of that particular group.
That's great, thanks.
Thank
and
you.
as I said, we're going to follow up with all of you, and with all the the people who weren't able to stay for the whole day, and some people who inquired or registered and weren't able to attend for whatever reason. If you're on the list, you are going to get some information to follow up on this, to start thinking about the next steps, to start helping us organize those next steps. And all of the data that we collected today, we're also sharing. And then we will also be sharing the link to the full recording once we edit down the bits that need to be, that aren't moving the conversation forward, like lunch. Thanks, Ben, for participating, and I know we'll be talking very soon. So those next steps, I would just want to, as we wrap up, I want you to think about those next steps. I look forward to hearing from you. I will put my contact information in the chat, and any further conversations anyone wants to have with me, please feel free to reach out to me or to any of my colleagues. I want to give some thanks as we wrap up. I want to thank my wonderful colleagues, Professor Luz Molina, who's a director of the Workplace Justice Project and who is the clinical professor for the Workplace Justice Project clinic at the law school, and all of Professor Molina's students who have been participating all day and have enlightened us all semester with what they're learning from their clients. and the work that they've put in. A special shout out to Shelby for being our technical support today, and for Will, whose blog work is gracing our website right now. And then I want to thank Andrea, our senior staff attorney, for all of her incredible work on this, on all the technical stuff. All those MailChimp emails and everything you got are all coming from Andrea, setting up the Zoom, everything, and especially for putting together the video, putting a lot of work, putting all the stuff we contributed together. And I want to thank the voices from the community, our community voices on the video, Pamela Bourgeois and Kim Robinson, Apollonia Broussard, and Connie Bro, who all agreed to be interviewed and to have their words as part of that video. I want to thank Jasmine Williams Washington. Jasmine works for community science, and we met Jasmine whenever it was 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when we got our first grant from the Kellogg Foundation. And Jasmine was our consultant for how to do our evaluations. And she took a trio of lawyers who had no idea how to do evaluation. And we have learned so much from Jasmine. And she and her teammates at Community Science are an incredible, incredible resource to us.
Fantastic.
And to Kellogg grantees. So thank you all for participating, for spending so much of a beautiful Friday when you could be at French Quarter Fest. Spending it on Zoom with us, and I look forward to talking to all of you really soon.
Have a good weekend.
And as they say on WWOZ, now get out there and listen to and enjoy some live local music. Thanks all.